In the Planescape campaign setting for D&D, there are 17 outer planes, which are essentially the realms of D&D's afterlife. There's one for each moral alignment, ranging from lawful evil to chaotic good and everything in between. I've already covered the planes of lawful evil, lawful good, chaotic evil, neutral lawful good, lawful neutral, and chaotic good in depth, as well as Sigil, the city that sits at the center of the outer planes. In this video, I'll be covering the plane of chaotic neutral, the ever-changing chaos of Limbo. I'll be using sources from all editions of D&D, but as usual, most of it comes from the Planescape books of 2nd edition. If you're wondering why I decided to do Limbo now, that's what my supporters over on Patreon voted for. If you're a fan of what I do and would like to support me, you could join my Patreon and gain the ability to vote on my videos as well. You'd also get access to update posts, ad-free videos, audio-only versions of my videos weeks before the final version is published, and you get your name at the end of my videos. So thank you to all my Patreon supporters for helping to make these videos possible. And before I really start, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video, DiceNest.com. This is the 3rd time they've sponsored one of my videos, so I now have 3 sets of dice from them, because each time they've sent me a new set. Dice Nest makes luxury handcrafted dice. You can find dice made out of gemstone, resin, metal, wood resin blends, and now also silicone. This time they sent me the Dragonflame dice in blue, and they also sent me this large D20, part of their planetary spin set, which has a die for each planet in the solar system. These both do look really cool, but I think I actually prefer to have the regular number face rather than the name of the planet or the dragon symbol like on the Dragonflame ones. Still, they're very nice looking, great feeling dice. And if you'd like some cool dice of your own, visit DiceNest.com and use my affiliate code WadeAllen for 15% off your order. And I'll earn 15% on all purchases that use my code. But they are luxury dice, so they're not the cheapest, though they are high quality. And for the record, I am open to taking other sponsorships. It's just that Dice Nest is the only one so far that I've received that has a product that I can actually get behind. I do use these dice whenever I play D&D. Most of the other sponsorship offers I've received have been from AI companies or products that I wouldn't use. But anyway, let's take a tour of Limbo. Whenever I'm trying to convey the character of an outer plane, I always like to start with its alignment. After all, each outer plane in D&D is the physical manifestation and representation of a moral alignment. And alignment is central to Planescape as a setting, so I think it makes sense as a starting point. Limbo is of course the plane of chaotic neutrality. Chaos in D&D means something different depending on what edition of D&D we're talking about. In the early days, chaos was the alignment of monsters and villains, not player characters. In those days, chaos and evil were the same thing. But then that changed, and chaos became a playable alignment. In the earlier editions, it was largely about randomness and non-determinism, as well as individualism and following your whims. But as the editions went on, it became less about the randomness part and more about the individualism part. So, in some ways, I think the term chaos can be a bit of a misnomer. To me, chaos implies utter disorganization. But in D&D, chaotic creatures can still be organized, at least to some extent. They can form societies and fall into hierarchies. To be chaotic is in many ways to be anti-society or anti-government, but perhaps a bit ironically, a group of anti-society people can still form a society, if for no other reason than practicality. In my Guide to the Abyss video, I explained this phenomenon of order arising from chaos through the difference between process randomness and pattern randomness, where a random process can result in non-random patterns. And I still think that's a useful way of looking at it, especially with older editions in mind where chaos does include a strong element of randomness. But another way to look at it is not through randomness, but through individual choices. If a chaotic creature is following the orders of another, it's not because they have some respect for authority or hierarchy as a concept, but because they respect the individual they're following, or because they believe it's in their best interest, at least in a chaotic good society. Chaotic neutral or evil societies are often still hierarchical, but that hierarchy is based on strength, rather than a set of rules. The strongest individual leads, not because the members of the hierarchy value this way of structuring society necessarily, but because stronger individuals can coerce the weaker ones. You obey not out of lawfulness, but out of fear for your life. And if a different individual wants to lead, they just have to prove that they're stronger. So a sort of order can still arise in a chaotic society, but that order is somewhat unstable, with new leaders or attempted coups being common. The fact that chaotic creatures are very individually minded means that they would be unlikely to come together as a collective to overthrow their current ruler. Either because they wouldn't even think to do this, or because if they tried, their chaotic nature would make them too disorganized or unreliable to succeed. They're bad at working together. So any challenges to the leader's rule come from individuals. So while all this is to say that chaotic hierarchies can exist, I would think that chaotic societies are much more loosely woven than lawful ones, with each individual member always facing the choice of whether it's better to stay in the society or leave it. And I'd think chaotic creatures are much more likely to leave a society than lawful creatures, due to their love of individuality and their contempt for collectivism. Also, on the topic of chaos and law, I know some people don't think this axis belongs in moral alignment, saying that chaos and law, or how individualistic or collectivist you are, has nothing to do with morality. And I think I pretty much agree with that, but I don't really think this is a problem. I and many other people often say moral alignment, but more accurately, it's just called alignment. Only one axis is truly for morality. The definitions of good and evil in D&D also depend on the edition. Sometimes it's more of a selflessness versus selfishness thing, and sometimes it's more of a helping versus harming thing, or a mix of both. But Limbo is neutral with respect to good and evil, so it has to be neither, or fit somewhere in between. And this is why I think the morally neutral alignments are the hardest ones to conceptualize, at least for me, because in my mind it often seems as if there's hardly any room at all between good and evil, like walking on a knife's edge. If good and evil are best characterized by selflessness and selfishness, where is the room between? Is it just a matter of degree? So neutral really would just mean only slightly good or only slightly evil? Maybe. If good and evil are best characterized by helping and harming, then at first it seems like there would be room in between to do neither, as the 3rd edition definition of neutrality suggests. But how much room is there actually? This version of neutrality is essentially a commitment to non-interventionism, to not intervene in the affairs of others. But non-interventionism can easily slip into evil, such as when you become a bystander to a harmful event. As Janice Ian in Mean Girls says,
"There are two kinds of evil people. People who do evil stuff and people who see evil stuff being done and don't try to stop it."
Consider Peter Singer's classic scenario of the drowning child. As you're going for a walk, you notice a small child drowning in a pond. You're a full-grown adult, and this is a rather shallow pond, so you'd be capable of saving the child without even fully submerging yourself. So your life wouldn't be at risk, and it would be trivially easy for you to do. Plus, there's no one else around, so if you don't save the child, they'll die. So what would a neutral person do? To not save the child seems patently evil, but to save the child seems good. The non-interventionist would do nothing, letting the child die. So a non-interventionist approach seems evil, which makes me think a neutral person wouldn't do that. Perhaps, rather than doing nothing, a neutral person wishes to maintain neutrality, and so might prevent evil things from happening. And I'm using evil here in the philosophical sense. Evil doesn't only refer to things done by people. For example, the problem of evil, an argument against the existence of a loving God, is pretty much entirely concerned with natural evils, like tsunamis and bone cancer. So a child drowning could be considered an evil. Maybe saving the child isn't good, it's just the default. Maybe an evil person lets the child drown, or even torments them as they do. A good person saves them and then dries them off, makes sure they're fed, and reunites them with their parents. And a neutral person merely pulls them out of the pond and then fucks off. Or, if saving the child is good and letting them die is evil, a neutral person manages to find some middle ground, saving the child, but then kicking them in the shins and stealing their lunch money to balance the scales. But Peter Singer's scenario entails far more than that. I simplified it to show that it's already difficult enough to arrive at how a neutral person might respond, but the full scenario might tell us a bit more about the morality of non-intervention. So you're not just saving a child, but in the process, you're irrevocably ruining your fancy new shoes that cost you a fair bit of money. The argument goes that it's still obviously evil to not save the child, even if it means suffering a bit financially for it. It then goes on to say that this is the situation you're in all the time, except the drowning child isn't right in front of you, but in some far-off place in the world. For a pretty small financial loss, you can save the lives of many children at any moment. If it's a moral obligation to save the child drowning in front of you, is it not still a moral obligation to prevent people dying from malaria? So the question is non-intervention still evil when you're not a bystander? While I don't think what I'm about to say necessarily holds up in terms of actual ethics, maybe the difference between neutral and evil in D&D can be found in the immediacy of the harm that you can prevent. Consider another scenario. You're in your car, stopped at a traffic light. While you're waiting for it to turn green, you notice a homeless man begging for money right next to you. You could help, harm, or do nothing. And unlike with the drowning child, in this situation, it would seem that doing nothing is not indistinguishable from harming. And that's because the homeless man isn't in imminent danger. The money you might give him will certainly make him happier and could help him live longer, yes, but it's not exactly saving his life. He wasn't moments from death. So without that sense of immediacy, perhaps there is more room for neutrality. And something that's related to immediacy that I think a neutral person might consider is the inability to predict the future. Perhaps the defense of non-intervention lies in the inability to know what effect your actions will actually have. What if that drowning child you save goes on to be the next Hitler? Then it would seem that maybe you should have let them drown. However, I don't think it's reasonable for anyone to behave this way, because it's not like you can avoid interacting with the rest of the world whatsoever. What if, through some Rube Goldberg-esque series of events, you eating some jam on toast this morning results in the destruction of the solar system, and if you wouldn't have eaten that toast, everything would have been fine? You have the same inability to predict the outcome of actions involving other people as you do with actions that don't, and both could lead to equally drastic outcomes. Though I do think this extreme sense of cautiousness or lack of certainty that might lead a person to non-interventionism does make more sense the less immediate the event. Because with a non-immediate danger, there's uncertainty on whichever path you take, but less so for something immediate. Any drowning child can be imagined to be the next Hitler, but almost none of them will be. But one thing is fairly certain: if you do nothing, the child will die. While I have been struggling to find the answer of how a neutral person would behave, there's one quite obvious solution that you've probably been thinking of, and that is, sometimes they do good things, and sometimes they do bad things. Not necessarily with the desire for balance in mind, but maybe that's just how their whims shake out. A neutral person stumbles upon a drowning child, and they might let them drown, or they might save them. It depends on how they're feeling. If they encounter a second drowning child, they might choose differently this time. The good they do cancels out the bad, and the bad they do cancels out the good, keeping them neutral. And I think that can make perfect sense, and is likely how most people play neutral characters in D&D. But one big issue with it is that I'm trying to figure out how neutral characters would operate in general, and that attitude seems far too chaotic and inconsistent to make sense for lawful neutral characters. Though it does make perfect sense for chaotic neutral characters, and I guess that's what really matters here. So I guess the answer might just be that neutrality looks very different depending on what kind of neutral you are. But let's see what the sourcebooks have to say about how chaotic neutral people act. In 1st edition AD&D, chaotic neutral characters value randomness and disorder above any concerns for good or evil. In fact, they seek to balance goodness and evil, believing that if either force prevailed, chaos would suffer. In 2nd edition AD&D, chaotic neutral characters believe that there is no order to anything, including their own actions. They follow their whims, with good and evil being irrelevant to their decisions. They are almost completely unreliable. The only reliable thing about them is that they can't be relied on. In 3rd edition, chaotic neutral characters are first and foremost individualists. They value their own freedom, but don't strive to protect the freedom of others. They avoid authority, resent restrictions, and challenge traditions. They follow their whims and can be unpredictable, but not totally random. In 4th edition, there is no such thing as chaotic neutrality. As I mentioned, in the earliest days of D&D, alignment existed as a single axis between law and chaos. Then it changed to a 2-axis scale, adding that separate moral component in, and it stayed that way for a long while. 4th edition went back to the old ways, but with a bit of a twist. It has what I would call a quasi-2-axis scale. It combines the law-chaos axis and the good-evil axis into one. So you can be good, lawful good, unaligned, evil, or chaotic evil. It's different from the original scale in that you don't have to be chaotic to be evil, but it's similar in that the only way to be chaotic is to also be evil. In 5th edition, chaotic neutral creatures follow their whims, holding their personal freedom above all else. The 2024 rules, commonly called 5.5e, doesn't really add anything else in this case. As ever, I think the 5th edition definition is too bare bones to be that useful, but really it has the same problem that most of these definitions have. It's clear that chaotic neutral characters follow their whims, but what if those whims tend toward evil? Not that they're doing evil on purpose, but just that the whims they follow happen to be destructive and harmful. Even when you look at it in the larger context of all the alignments, it still seems like the chaotic neutral definition covers ground that's quite far from neutral. The 5th edition chaotic evil definition says that chaotic evil creatures act with arbitrary violence, spurred by their greed, hatred, or bloodlust. But what if your evil whims aren't spurred by greed, hatred, or bloodlust? What if they're spurred by curiosity? Like, you just want to see what would happen if you blow up a school. All these definitions, except for the 1st edition one, which does explicitly say that chaotic neutral characters seek to maintain a balance between good and evil, seem to suggest, whether it's implied or directly stated, that all it takes to be chaotic neutral is to act on your own whims without a concern for what's good or evil. I discussed this a little bit in my Mechanist video, which of course is the other plane that's neutral with respect to good and evil, and I think it applies equally well here. I don't think it makes sense to say that all it takes to be neutral is to not care about good or evil. If you don't care about good or evil, and are not motivated whatsoever by those things, your actions can still be good or evil. If you kill people, but don't label it as bad or think of it as bad, it's still bad. Morality is not simply a matter of your own personal definitions, and that's especially true in Planescape. It wouldn't be possible for each of the planes to have its own moral character if morality was defined independently by every individual. Then so long as a demon labels himself as lawful good, he belongs in Mount Celestia. No, that demon actually has to behave according to a greater definition of lawful good in order to belong in Mount Celestia. Though Planescape is about belief, and belief does shape reality, but not so much on the level of the individual. Or at least, the belief of the individual doesn't really have the power to affect more than the individual in most cases. For instance, if you stop believing in your own existence, then you'll stop existing. An individual demon could believe his way into belonging in Mount Celestia, but it would be through that belief causing a change in his behavior, turning him lawful good. But his solitary belief wouldn't be able to change the nature of Mount Celestia or of what it means to be lawful good. Large-scale change requires large-scale belief. If all of the demons that exist, or some critical mass of them, believed that they belonged in Mount Celestia, then they would. But that would most likely result in either a change in the nature of Mount Celestia or a change in the nature of demons, not necessarily a change in the definition of lawful good. So what you see there is that the belief of a group of people is capable of restructuring the world physically, but is it capable of restructuring morality itself? I've said in my other videos that Planescape is a setting of objective morality, and I do think that's true in a TLDR kind of way. But when it comes down to it, the way that it's written, Planescape is ultimately a setting of moral relativism, but in the broadest possible sense, relative to the collective beliefs of everyone in the multiverse, or at least everyone who even has beliefs on the topic at hand. On the scale of moral relativism, it's as close as it can possibly be to moral objectivism. So if enough people believed that murder is actually good, would it become good? In Planescape, I think the answer is maybe, but that's unlikely to ever happen, as the beliefs of the people getting murdered matter too, and surely they don't think it's good when it happens to them, which reveals something of an instability in that particular belief, as it's a hypocritical belief to hold. How can you truly believe something to be good if you don't want it to happen to you? Although if the people of the multiverse are suicidal, then I guess it works just fine. But I think in Planescape, for the very definitions of morality to actually change would require far more of a concerted effort of collective belief change than is even possible. whereas more local, more tangible, and less foundational things, like where landmasses belong in the Outer Planes, are more readily altered by belief. Which keeps the underlying structure of the multiverse pretty much morally objective, and that keeps it close enough to how I think it works in the real world. Which is that morality isn't something that exists independently of minds, but also isn't decided by minds. Rather, it's discovered. Because a problem with treating morality as an invention is that it becomes arbitrary and time-dependent. To answer yes to the question, was it okay to own slaves hundreds of years ago when it was widely accepted, seems illogical to me. Or to put it more broadly, can something be morally wrong if no one thinks of it as wrong? I think the answer is obviously yes, but that doesn't mean that there's an objective morality that exists independently of us. Because the answer to the question, would there be such thing as morality if life didn't exist, seems to me to be an obvious no. Thinking of morality as something we discover about our own nature allows us to provide sensical answers to those questions. So the development of morality isn't the process of inventing new rules, but of beings coming to understand how they want to be treated and identifying a framework to keep those desires consistent with how they treat others. I think the reason that neutrality can be confusing and inconsistent is because there's often an unnoticed conflation of two different dimensions of moral thinking. You see, neutrality is often described, and not just in D&D, as amorality. But amorality can very often amount to the same thing as immorality. Being amoral is to not care about morality. Being immoral is to do bad things. So it's possible to be amoral and immoral. One dimension describes an attitude you have about morality, and the other describes the moral consequences of your actions. It's a bit like the often overlooked two-dimensional scale of God belief. There's the scale of theism to atheism, which describes whether you believe in a god, and there's the scale of Gnosticism to agnosticism, which describes whether you claim to know that a god exists. You can fall on any place within the continuum, though I think the Gnostic atheism position is probably the rarest, and most atheists I know are more properly described as agnostic atheists. So with these discussions of moral alignment in D&D, I think splitting morality into two axes might sometimes be pretty helpful. On the one hand, there's your attitude about morality, whether or not you care about it and what you're trying to achieve. And on the other hand, there's what you actually do and how it impacts the world around you. You could think of it as intention versus consequence, or motivation versus action. You can be moral, amoral, or potentially any combination. I think the moral-immoral alignment might be the most common. People that care about morality and want to do good, but are actually bad. Though I do think the immoral section on the first axis is rather rare. People who care about morality and want to do bad. And that's rather relevant here, because if true, it shows us that most of the people who do bad either don't care about morality or do care about it and are trying to do good. So describing neutrality merely in terms of not caring about morality doesn't suffice to tease apart the difference between evil and neutrality, because most people who are evil aren't actively trying to be evil. So essentially what I'm arguing is that while knowing where someone lands on the attention or motivation axis is informative, it isn't ultimately sufficient. Anyway, it seems to me that simply following your whims, being an individualist, and prizing your freedom above all else and not caring about good and evil isn't enough to be chaotic neutral. I would think that the sum of the consequences of your actions has to achieve some rough balance between good and evil. Though I would think there are different types of chaotic neutral on offer. First, there's the type of person who operates entirely on purposeful randomness, like Two-Face, if the choices he made for himself included more good options. Two-Face's typical scenario is, if this coin lands on heads, I'm gonna shoot your friend in the face. If it lands on tails, I'm gonna throw your dog off a cliff. So a neutral Two-Face would instead have options like, if this coin lands on heads, I'm gonna cut off your leg and eat it. If it lands on tails, I'm gonna throw you a birthday party and pay for your son's college education. And this neutral Two-Face doesn't always have to provide one good option and one bad option. One scenario could be bad, and the next could be good, then maybe neutral. Like, heads, I'm gonna paint my house yellow. Tails, I'm gonna hitchhike to Florida. Another type of chaotic neutral character might actively seek to maintain a balance between good and evil, like how the petitioners of the Outlands behave, but a lot more unpredictable. If they see harm being done, they might try to stop it to keep the scales balanced. Or they might help it along and balance the scales by helping someone else out later. If there's been good vibes for too long, they might ruin it just to make sure things are balanced, or they might wait a while and then ruin it even more later. Whatever they're feeling, but with a mind toward keeping things neutral. Another type of chaotic neutral character might have no interest in good and evil at all, just doing whatever strikes their fancy at the moment, sometimes helping, sometimes harming, sometimes neither. This one is probably the most realistic. And then there's people who are just insane, and act without rhyme or reason in a sort of uncontrollable way. But what all these types have in common is that their actions don't skew good or evil overall. These are the types of people and creatures that you'll find in Limbo, at least in theory, because, as we'll see, it doesn't really shake out that way. Limbo is, unsurprisingly, the most chaotic plane there is. It's an ever-shifting, infinite expanse of chaotic elemental energy, though the unformed earth, air, fire, and water is so thoroughly mixed up that the material it forms doesn't really resemble any of those four elements. It's something like a soup or a broth. It's a swirling, hazy, dry fluid that you can only see through for a few yards. You can't breathe it, and it slowly dissolves anything it touches, so it's not exactly safe. It also doesn't have gravity to speak of. You won't sink in the fluid or anything. You'll just hang in place. This primordial soup, also called chaos matter or primal chaos, goes on forever in all directions. The soup isn't uniform, with currents and thick regions and storms and whatnot, but there are very often pockets of unmixed elemental energy that form for a time and then blend back in with the background broth of the whole plane. Pockets of pure fire, air, water, or earth are common throughout the chaos matter. These pockets may last for a fraction of a second, or they may remain stable for months. They can be as small as a grain of sand, or as large as a continent. After all, it wouldn't be that chaotic if it was just a consistent sea of elemental soup. And it also wouldn't be that chaotic if these pockets of pure elements behaved in a predictable way. But it's not just pure elements. Sometimes there are pockets of air and water, or earth and fire, or air and earth, or whatever combination you like. You might be hanging out in the broth, and the spot next to you coalesces into a giant chunk of magma, and then reshapes into a slab of ice, and then melts back into the chaos matter. But more than that, and this is what really makes it chaotic, is that the chaos matter doesn't even stay chaotic. It's not even stable that way. The primordial soup is infinitely changeable, here and there not only changing into pockets of its constituent elements, but forming into normal terrain. Forests, mountains, meadows, tundras, you name it, complete with breathable air and normal gravity, until it inevitably dissolves back into broth. The natural variations of chaos matter never take on the form of anything artificial, though, like buildings or chairs. However, that's not all there is to it. The chaos matter of Limbo is so full of the potential to become other things that it can easily be shaped by the will of a thinking being. All you have to do is concentrate, and you can shape the soup around you into a livable environment. You can make landscapes, plant life, buildings, and even animals. This is called chaos shaping, and it's how non-native races can manage to survive in this plane, and even prosper. But if you stop concentrating, then your thought's creation dissolves back into chaos, just like anything else in the plane does. So Limbo is only as safe as you make it, and especially for people who've never been here, it can be quite dangerous, downright deadly even. Some people can't manage to figure out the trick of chaos shaping fast enough to save themselves from the plane's unpredictable dangers. And many manage to figure it out only after being drowned a bit, roasted a bit, and smashed a bit while the chaos matter shifts form around them. Though there are those to whom chaos shaping comes naturally. These few people who are exceptionally gifted at it, allowing them to perform feats far beyond what anyone else would be capable of, are called anarchs. And I'll talk more about them and about chaos shaping in the next section of the video. When you enter the plane, you've got to be prepared for the worst. Limbo is so chaotic that, unlike other planes, there really is no such thing as a stable portal location. Sure, maybe the Sigil side of the portal is always in the same place, but you never know what to expect on the other side, or where it'll drop you off. Maybe in a sphere of lava, maybe in solid rock, maybe a blob of freezing cold water, or acid, or a giant bundle of thorns, or maybe you'll just find yourself in the unformed chaos matter, which, keep in mind, is not breathable and is erosive, eating away at your physical form until there's nothing left if you stay in there long enough. Though maybe you'll get lucky, and it'll just be a pocket of air. But even that's pretty unsettling given the fact that there's no gravity. But you can get even luckier than that. Maybe you find yourself in a natural environment that looks as if it could belong anywhere else in the multiverse, and you might even find yourself in a domain. Domains are places that a thinking being has imposed their will on, to shape it and make it stable. Another term for it is stabilized terrain. Normally, a plane is divided into layers and realms. Layers are infinite in size and are often quite different from each other, but still are similar enough and connected enough to be part of the same plane. Typically, they're completely separate spaces, requiring portals or conduits to get from one to another, while realms are finite spaces within a layer, though they can be quite different from the rest of the layer around them. And what makes a realm is that it's ruled by at least one god. However, in Limbo, it makes more sense to forget about layers and just think in terms of realms and domains. Domains are like realms, but they don't require gods to make them. So the cool thing about Limbo is that it's kind of like anybody can play God and have their own realm, or, domain. Though the person or people concentrating on a domain's existence have to stay there to keep it around, whereas the gods can leave their realms and they'll stay intact and don't need to maintain concentration on them. However, even the stablest domains in Limbo are subject to what's known as mini-flux, which is that little things tend to get forgotten and fall into chaos, either dissolving into soup or changing into other things entirely, which means that you've got to keep track of things that you don't want to dissolve. The people who maintain these domains don't want to have to keep track of every single little object. It's a plane of individualism, after all, and using your will to keep absolutely everything stable would impose more structure and order on things than the people of Limbo would be comfortable with. Even in domains, they like a bit of unpredictability. I said it makes sense to forget about layers in Limbo, not because Limbo only has one layer, but because the layers it does have don't really behave like layers. In fact, they don't fit the definitions of what makes a layer so much that many inhabitants of the Outer Planes, called planers, consider Limbo to just have one layer. But some sages disagree, claiming that Limbo does have layers. They just change too much to be properly defined. This is a case where I feel like the things written about Limbo in the Planescape books must have been written very early on in production, before Planescape established more of its own identity, separate from what was written in the first edition Manual of the Planes. Because in first edition, the layers of a plane weren't completely separate spaces. They touched each other physically. At these borders, there were magical barriers that required a successful wisdom check to pass through. In the Planescape books, that's mostly no longer how the planes are described, but Limbo is one of the few exceptions. So what the sages point out is that Limbo has these magical barriers that define layer boundaries. The thing is, the boundaries move, and the places throughout the plane move around too. So the Githzerai city of Shrak-Talor might be found in one layer today, but in a different layer tomorrow, for example. Plus, none of the layers look any different from one another. Limbo looks like the same swirling primal chaos matter filled with randomly forming terrain and chunks of elemental matter, no matter which layer you're in. So what does it really mean for Limbo to have layers? And does it really matter? Well, those who do claim it has layers say there are 5. The first is called Gith and Slaad. The second is called Susanoo. The third is Agni. The fourth is Indra. And the fifth is called the Layer of Lost Gods, supposedly named after their most frequent inhabitants. But of course, that's not consistent. The Githzerai and Slaadi are found in more than just the first layer, and the realms of the gods Susanoo, Agni, and Indra move all over as well. Though it's unknown what the last layer is named for. But if there really are lost gods there, then I suppose you shouldn't really expect to be able to find them. Another way in which Limbo feels like it was written with first edition in mind is that it's absolutely full of conduits. The astral plane is well known for its conduits, wispy, interdimensional tubes that allow for near instantaneous transport from the material plane to the first layer of any of the outer planes. These are called astral conduits. But there are also planar conduits, conduits that connect one area of a plane to a different area, usually a different layer of the same plane. And these planar conduits aren't mentioned very frequently at all in the Planescape books, except for Limbo. They're very prominent in Limbo, as Limbo has more than any other plane. Normally, conduits are quite stable, and the formation of a new conduit or the death of an old conduit are rare events. But in Limbo, new ones are constantly appearing and old ones are constantly disappearing, and they're always moving. So it's easy enough to find one to jump into, but it's incredibly difficult to know where it'll lead. And planar conduits sometimes even lead to other planes entirely, so you might jump into one expecting to be taken somewhere else in Limbo, but you land in the abyss. Oops, guess you're gonna die. Luckily, that's not the only way to get around the plane quickly. There's also a few giant whirlpools in the plane's chaos matter, kind of like how wormholes theoretically work in real life, by shortening the distance in space, allowing you to spend a few hours getting to a location that might otherwise take weeks or months to get to. Though the only trouble is that since the chaos matter is mostly opaque, only providing visibility for a few yards, it's hard to know where these whirlpools lead. But on the plus side, they are much more stable than conduits, with most of them having been in existence forever. This surprising stability in the plane of chaos leads some to believe that these whirlpools are focus points for Limbo's flux. If you're not willing to risk jumping into a portal, conduit, or whirlpool that you don't know the exact destination of, you can always just walk. See, the nice thing about being able to shape the chaos around you with your mind is that you can just create a landscape bubble that moves with you, like building the road as you walk it. But that's not a great option either, because Limbo, like all the outer planes, is infinite, so you might be walking for a very long time. Really, it's like the plane is just begging you to embrace the chaos and just jump into a portal or conduit or whirlpool. But not everything that lives in Limbo craves that chaos, so pretty much every permanent town in the plane has a Guidon or Guidon. Guidons are like the lighthouses leading the way to safety in Limbo's chaotic sea. They're magical obelisks that resonate with the locate object spell regardless of range, each with its own unique magical vibration. You can even buy items permanently imbued with the locate object spell to act as Guidon compasses. That way, you can repeatedly jump into conduits that point in the direction of your Guidon compass until you eventually reach your desired destination. One thing I think is strange about Limbo, and you might have been thinking this too, is why Limbo is so elemental in nature when it's not an inner plane. The inner planes, except for the positive and negative energy planes, are all elemental planes. Plus, the outer and inner planes are supposedly not connected. So much so that when you try to summon elementals in the outer planes, you actually summon pseudo-elementals. So why would Limbo be so elemental in nature? Honestly, the way all of the inner planes fit together, it might make more sense if Limbo was right here in the center of them, as the intersection between the planes of air, water, earth, and fire. But it's not. It's an outer plane. And there isn't really a good in-world explanation for this. But that supposed lack of connection between the outer and inner planes is not consistent throughout the source material. And you've got to consider that while it may be the most striking in Limbo, all of the outer planes contain the elements. It's not like they're all immaterial. So if you want an answer, admittedly a made-up answer, then perhaps the inner and outer planes do connect, and Limbo is where they're closest. Limbo, so strongly elemental, but also so strongly yielding to the beliefs of its inhabitants. A perfect intersection between the power of the elements from the inner planes and the power of belief and thought from the outer planes. Limbo is depicted differently in different editions of D&D. I've mostly been talking about 2nd edition, and this is both because 2nd edition has the most to say, and because 2nd edition is the edition that Planescape was made for. In 1st edition, Limbo is pretty similar to 2nd edition, but there are a few notable differences. For one thing, 1st edition notes that all solid objects exert gravity on anything they touch, so if there's a clump of earth floating in the chaos, you can walk along its entire surface. Whereas it seems like in 2nd edition, gravity only comes into effect when the chaos matter takes the shape of a landscape. And I'm reading between the lines here, but I think it would be more like floating island style of gravity, where you can't walk along the bottom of a landscape chunk. Another difference is that in 2nd edition, portals are always moving around. But in 1st edition, portals to neighboring planes, Isgard, the Outlands, and Pandemonium, don't move, serving as calm centers of storms of circling matter. Though there is still some chaos involved, as each portal has a random chance of sending you to any of those 3 planes. In 3rd edition, gravity is different yet again. Each individual chooses the direction that gravity pulls them, which allows for some cool maneuvering and would really make clear the difference between a newcomer to the plane and a native. Imagine fighting someone so comfortable in Limbo that they can switch their subjective gravity rapidly and smoothly. They fall up, then sideways, then down again, all before you can even catch on and realize that their sword has punctured your lungs from behind. I imagine that it could make for some pretty forceful attacks. You could time your gravity shift with your stab so that you're literally falling at them as you attack. Plus, your own subjective experience of gravity is transferred to whatever you're wearing, holding, or carrying. So you could grab someone, reverse your gravity, and let go of them, and watch as they fall up, crashing into the ceiling if they're not quick enough to think to change their own gravity. This subjective gravity also means you can travel pretty fast through the plane, as you can just fall everywhere. Though it's slower to fall through chaos matter or water than it is to fall through air pockets. And you do have to be pretty vigilant doing this, as you don't want to be falling for 20 minutes, get lazy, and not notice as an earth chunk materializes right in time for you to splatter all over it. 3rd edition also specifies that Limbo has no day or night, and I imagine that must be true regardless of the edition. I guess Limbo's broth must provide some ambient amount of light. And while 2nd edition expressly says that the natural fluctuations of chaos matter never take the shape of artificial constructions, 3rd edition mentions ruined castles drifting through the miasma. In 4th edition, there's no such thing as Limbo. Except there kind of is. 4th edition is in nearly all ways a drastic departure from previous editions. It rethinks alignment, combat, some of the core mechanics of the game, the lore, and the cosmology. Rather than using the Great Wheel cosmology of Planescape, it uses the World Axis cosmology, where the prime material plane and its 2 reflections, the Feywild and the Shadowfell, stand in the middle, with the Astral Sea and all its astral dominions above, and the Elemental Chaos and all its realms below. The Elemental Chaos is pretty much Limbo, except it's got an overall evil vibe and has more going on in it. It even has the entire Abyss inside of it. It's basically 4th edition's version of the Inner Planes, the Abyss, and Limbo all rolled into one. But the general structure of the Elemental Chaos is like Limbo, with chaotic material that's always coalescing into more pure elements or terrain and then dissolving again, but controllable through exertion of will. However, like the Inner Planes, it's the foundation of all raw material in creation, but it also seeks to pull all creation back into itself and return it to chaos and entropy. But you can also tell that it's what became of Limbo in 4th edition, at least mechanic-wise and kind of thematic-wise, if not lore-wise, because it's where the Githzerai and the Slaadi live, which does make for a cool equilibrium between the Githzerai and the Githyanki, these 2 opposing races each living on the foundational planes on the opposing ends of the multiverse. I've shat on 4th edition before, but honestly, the more I read from 4th edition, the more I like it. My biggest problem with 4th edition originally was that it was just too drastic a departure to be cohesive with the rest of D&D, especially if this is supposed to somehow all exist in one continuous timeline in world. I still feel that way, but my growing appreciation for 4th edition is directed at 4th edition as a standalone thing. When looked at in the broader context, it's a mess, but when looked at by itself, it's got a lot of really cool systems and lore. For instance, as far as I can tell, 4th edition had much better combat than 5th edition and really had a clear vision of what it was doing with it. Whereas 5th edition is kind of muddled, and I think tries too hard to be able to accommodate everything that it ends up not doing anything well. And that doesn't apply to just combat. Obviously, 5th edition was able to reach a much wider audience this way, but it seems like 4th edition served the players it did have far better. And 4th edition does have some pretty cool lore, like with the Oberiths, Tharizdun, and the creation of the Abyss that I talked about in my video on that plane, and some more cool lore on the Modrons that I talked about in my Mechanist video, and even some more cool lore about the Slaadi that I'll talk about later in this one. Anyway, the Elemental Chaos pretty much has all the design elements that Limbo has, plus some extra stuff with a few changes. For instance, there is consistent gravity, so there's a defined up and down here. However, gravity only exerts its influence on creatures and non-native objects. Islands, rivers, ice, and so on float through the sky, but people are pulled downward. Also, the entire plane isn't permeated by chaos matter like it is in Limbo. Instead, it's mostly filled with air, usually breathable, but in some places toxic. And there's a lot more land, floating all over the place, as well as the blobs of fire or lightning or water or whatever other elemental material you might expect. The chaos matter still exists, but it flows in currents throughout the plane, though it seems to be invisible. Perhaps rather than itself forming into random elements, it changes the matter it passes by into other things. But 5th edition brings Limbo back. However, in some ways, this edition is the worst, because it seeks to bring back what was in those earlier editions while also preserving what was introduced in 4th edition. often to confusing results. For instance, 4th edition adds the Feywild and makes it the home of the Eladrin, removing the Eladrin's previous home of Arborea. Mostly, Arvindor does exist as an astral dominion, but then 5th edition keeps the Feywild and brings back Arborea, when they're already very similar. I said a few minutes ago that it would make sense if Limbo was an inner plane at the intersection of air, fire, water, and earth. And in 5th edition, this is what the elemental chaos is. Well, technically it's not the central inner plane, but rather the outermost one. But still, it's where the elements mix chaotically. So 5th edition keeps the elemental chaos, but it also brings back Limbo. So now there's 2 very similar planes of elemental chaos for some reason. But the Slaadi and Githzerai go back to being from Limbo? So what's the elemental chaos even for? In any plane, the largest group of people living there is often the petitioners, which are the souls of mortals that get sent to live out their afterlives in the plane that best matches their alignment in life, or to the plane that their patron deity resides in, if they have one. Petitioners bound to a deity go to that deity's realm, and the form they take depends on the god's preferences. Petitioners of a plane, though, have their own characteristic appearance. In Limbo, it's actually quite hard to find petitioners, not because they're rare, but because they blend in so well. You see, Limbo's petitioners are living, thinking clumps of chaos matter, and naturally they are unaffected by the deleterious conditions of chaos matter, like the inability to breathe it and how it dissolves your body. Many people, especially those from the prime material plane, who typically know far less than they think they do about the outer planes, and are often called the clueless for that very reason, think that spirits that end up in Limbo just get swept up into the background chaos of the whole plane, essentially losing their autonomy and sense of self. But that's not true, at least not in 2nd edition. Chaos is all about individuality, after all. They retain their individuality, their personality, and their quirks and autonomy. Most people just wouldn't notice a Limbo petitioner if it was standing right next to them. Literally. But if you know the trick, they become a bit easier to spot. Still not easy, but easier. The real external difference between regular chaos matter and a petitioner is that you never find a petitioner in that indeterminate, brothy state. They're always taking the shape of something specific, like a pillar of flame, a cloud, a boulder, mist, a wave, whatever. And since they're petitioners of pure chaos, they don't retain any one form for very long, changing along with their ever-shifting moods. Though I should note that the eventual fate of nearly all petitioners is absorption into their plane, or merging with their god. So the clueless, despite being clueless, are ultimately right. They're just skipping a pretty important phase of existence, as I imagine the lifespan of any petitioner is multiple times longer than their mortal lifespan was. Another notable feature of the petitioners of Limbo is that they really love stories, especially ones with lots of action and twists and turns. So if you do find a petitioner, or suspect that one is nearby, you can often coax it into helping you by offering it a compelling story. The problem is that the petitioner's moods and attention spans are so chaotic that they're likely to get distracted, lose interest, or forget that they agreed to help you. It's like every petitioner in this plane is suffering from a severe case of ADHD. So you've got to make a lot of effort to hold their attention. The petitioners are a bit different in other editions. In 1st edition, what the clueless believe about petitioners getting swept up into the matter of the plane is true, except sometimes a collection of spirits combine forces to form a chaos elemental, which technically isn't an elemental at all. They appear as abominable piles of man-like matter with tentacles, horns, trunks, and so on. 2nd edition does away with these chaos elementals, but replaces them with similar creatures called chaos beasts that I'll describe in the next section, though chaos beasts are not petitioners. In 3rd edition, it goes both ways. Some petitioners just immediately get absorbed into the plane, but others retain their individuality as insane, swirling masses of gibbering, laughing chaos stuff, which to me sounds like they do often take on the form of indeterminate chaos matter, at least some of the time, rather than always shifting between elemental states. But mortals do live in Limbo too. A lot of them, actually. At first glance, Limbo seems like a pretty harsh environment that people would want to avoid. But the ability to shape the chaos matter with your mind into whatever terrain you want actually can make it a pretty nice place to live, so long as you can maintain concentration. So you can find all types here. Humans, gnomes, elves, dwarves, Bariar, tieflings, and probably much weirder, as it is the plane of chaos after all, so it would only make sense for there to be some really weird creatures living here. But honestly, even though Planescape overall is a wacky setting, and it's supposed to be, it's got a pretty standard array of races for the most part. It could do with a few more outlandish denizens. But of all these standard D&D races, the one that dominates Limbo is the Githzerai. Githzerai can be found all over the Great Wheel, but Limbo is their primary plane. Githzerai typically look like tall, thin humanoids with yellow or green pigmented skin, and Voldemort noses. Like the Githyanki, but a little more human-looking, more monk-like in attire, and with a seeming tendency for baldness. As their names and almost identical appearances would suggest, the Githzerai and the Githyanki have a shared history. They used to be one people, humans enslaved by the Mind Flayers in the deep past, but they were physically altered by the Mind Flayers' genetic experiments and developed psionic powers as a survival mechanism against their masters. Their leader, Gith, led a successful rebellion against the Mind Flayers, but upon winning their freedom, they splintered. Another prominent member of their race, Zerthamon, accused Gith of being evil, claiming that she would establish a tyranny no better than that of the Mind Flayers. So they broke out in civil war, Zerthamon was killed, and his followers retreated to Limbo. They took the name Githzerai, meaning those who spurn Gith, while the other faction established themselves in the astral plane and took the name Githyanki, meaning those who follow Gith. Because of their history as a race enslaved to the Mind Flayers, the Githzerai are a suspicious, insular people. They're not evil like the Githyanki are, but they're not exactly friendly either. They've also maintained their hatred for the Githyanki ever since that schism all those thousands of years ago. They send frequent raids to the astral plane, believing that they need to perpetually keep the Githyanki off balance, otherwise the Githyanki will be able to put a plan in motion to eradicate them. The Githzerai, then, are essentially completely focused on their own survival. They have little interest in much else, and don't make time for building friendships with other races. They're a highly disciplined and ascetic people, devoting themselves to strengthening the power of mind and body. They're also rather fanatical, believing in the inerrant rightness of their mission and their decisions, and of their god king, their apparently immortal leader, the great Githzerai, Zareth Menhyar Ag Gith. With all this in mind, it can be rather challenging to think of them as chaotic neutral. Second edition justifies this by saying that their intense focus on their own survival means that they have no concern for good or evil, and that their fierce loyalty and discipline is a matter of the free choices of individuals, not the compliance of slaves. But I personally have some reservations. If such a highly regimented society like the Githzerai can be considered chaotic merely because their collective loyalty is comprised of individual choices, that seems like it expands what can be considered chaotic way too far. It's a fine line between this and what I was saying about chaotic hierarchies at the beginning of the video, but I think a clear difference is in stability and looseness of organization. A hierarchical but still chaotic society like that of the Eladrin can make sense because it's very loosely organized and decentralized. Sure, all Eladrin acknowledge Queen Morwell as superior, but they just do whatever they want to, and each Eladrin court is pretty much an independent unit. And the societies of the Abyss are hierarchical but still chaotic because powerful demons hold weaker demons in line through threat of death. But the weaker demons still try their luck every once in a while, and try to prove their own dominance, so there's an instability there. Plus, the demonic armies are notoriously impossible to control, which is a huge reason why the demons haven't won the Blood War already. There's supposed to be far more demons than devils, but they end up evenly matched because the demons are so disorganized. But none of these things are true of Githzerai society, so I just don't see how they're supposed to be chaotic. 5th edition, though, resolves this problem by just making them lawful neutral. So at least now the behavior matches the alignment. But then you have the possible issue of a lawful neutral race being based in a chaotic neutral plane. But is this a problem? With how acquiescent Limbo is to ordering, it doesn't seem like a contradiction in the nature of the plane for it to harbor a large amount of lawful people. Plus, just because order can arise from chaos, that doesn't mean the underlying chaos is any less chaotic. However, I am left wondering if cosmic realignment would be an issue, which is when part of a plane moves to another plane that better matches the alignment of the people living there. If you've got a domain filled with lawful people, would it not eventually leave Limbo? Honestly, perhaps that could be said of any domain. If you're exerting your will over the chaos matter to keep it in one shape, to keep it stable, does there come a point where you're suppressing its chaotic tendency to change into something else for so long that it leaves the plane altogether? I would think so. And I honestly don't have a good answer as to why this wouldn't be a constant issue for anybody wanting to set up shop in Limbo. I guess you could just be nomadic. Perhaps every group of people maintaining a domain in Limbo makes sure to not linger in any one spot for too long. Or perhaps mini-flux is the solution. The amount of chaos that still does exist within these ordered domains is enough to counteract cosmic realignment. Or perhaps the constant movement of the entire plane solves this problem. Perhaps every domain actually isn't using the same chaos matter to manifest their terrain day after day. Perhaps the constant fluctuation of it all means that the domain is moving, and the chaos matter that comprises it is moving away and being replaced by other chaos matter. But it doesn't really make a material difference for the people living there, except for the fact that it means they get to avoid cosmic realignment on a technicality. But anyway, Planescape is a setting of philosophies and factions, and most planes have some group or another that call it home. Limbo's got 3. The first is the Chaositex, or maybe you'd prefer Xaositex, or maybe you'd prefer Gloopgerben, as they've been known to change their name every now and then. This chaotic group is one of the 15 factions of Sigil, at least in 2nd edition. They no longer exist in 5th edition. The factions of Sigil are the groups that are vying for power and control over the city and the rest of the planes, and most of them have some official role in the city. Not the Chaositex. They don't really even have an unofficial role. If anything, it would be disturbers of the peace, or psychos. Though a correction to what I've said about Chaositex before is that they aren't actually crazy, at least not most of them. They just seem crazy. They believe that the only order there is in the multiverse is what people try to impose on it. Their motto, or tagline, to the extent that they can actually agree on a unifying concept at all, is the Chaositex, who spread beauty through chaos. Although I guess that doesn't mean much, because I'm sure you can guess how reliable a chaosman's sense of beauty is. Essentially, they just live in the moment, acting on intuition, doing whatever strikes them as fun at any given time. The more you plan, the more the universe unplans. Inexperienced members of the faction try to create chaos, but what it's really all about is trying to be a part of the chaos. Not necessarily to force chaos to happen, but to ride the wave of chaos wherever it goes and whenever it appears. Sometimes they're quite violent, sometimes they're innocuous, and sometimes they produce real wonders. For example, a few centuries ago, the Chaositex assassinated the leader, called the Factol, of the Harmonium by hitting him in the head with an hourglass. A decade ago, they managed to arrange an alliance with every faction at the same time. It only lasted about 12 minutes, though, because the other factions realized what was happening. One time, the Sensates threw a party and invited the Chaosmen. About 1,000 of them showed up, and with the direction of a few anarchists, that is, members of the Revolutionary League, one of the biggest riots Sigil had ever seen raged across the city, known as the Days of Chaos. One time, a mob of Chaosmen went around killing the clueless just for being stupid. One time, all of the Chaositex acted normal for a week, just to throw everyone off. And recently, a bunch of them got together to paint a mural on the Great Gymnasium, which ended up being one of the most beautiful works of art in the Plains. The Factol of the Chaositex is a Githzerite named Karen or Karan, though he often doesn't feel like being Factol, and so he quits. But most of the time he does feel like it. He leads by example, and the other Chaositex follow him because he's filled with good ideas for how to embrace the chaos. This whole page right here is great, but one of my favorite quotes by him is, "I used to think rocks were eggs for earth elementals, and I still wonder once in a while, but not about that." The Chaositex don't really have a proper headquarters in Sigil, but if they did, it would be the Hive, which is a sprawling and ever-changing slum in the Hive Ward, and it's pretty much the same in Limbo. There's a lot of them here, but they don't have a building or a headquarters. They don't even really seem to do anything. They just come here to revel in the eternal newness of chaos. While factions are organizations that hold sway in Sigil, there are other organizations that don't, and these are called sects. 2 of them are based in Limbo. The Converts, also called chameleons or turncoats, are a sect all about skepticism and the pursuit of knowledge. For the Converts, the more you learn, the more questions you have, and learning is ultimately the process of finding out how little you really know. They believe that the multiverse is just too big for anyone to truly understand, and that it's not possible to be 100% sure of anything. That doesn't mean they give up, though. They still try to understand, to come closer to the truth. They still believe things. They're just aware that every belief they have is a placeholder for a better future belief, which will itself be a placeholder, and so on. Every theory they hold about how the multiverse works or what's important in life is temporary, ready to be thrown out the moment they learn of one that brings them closer to the unattainable truth. They're called converts, chameleons, and turncoats because they change their minds more readily than most. They join other factions, learn what they can from them, and then leave when they come to see the limitations in that faction's worldview, only to repeat the process again with a new faction. So they prefer to reside in Limbo, because here, just like their philosophy, nothing is certain. They have no leader, instead operating as a loose organization of like minds, and as such, they don't really have a particular headquarters in the plane. You'll just find them kind of spread around the plane, though they can be found in high numbers in the Outlands as well. The final group to be found in Limbo is also the most important, and that's the Anarchs Guild. They have no established presence in Sigil, which makes them a sect, but unlike pretty much all the other sects, they literally can only be found in one plane. This is because their whole basis for existence only makes sense in Limbo, so they have no need of being in Sigil or anywhere else for that matter. You see, the Anarchs Guild is all about chaos shaping, that ability I mentioned before where the chaos matter of Limbo can be controlled and turned into other things through mental concentration. Naturally, chaos shaping is only a thing in Limbo, so while it's possible to find a member of the Anarchs Guild outside of Limbo, the sect has no reason to leave the plane. The members of the Anarchs Guild are, unsurprisingly, called Anarchs, but they're also called Chaos Masters or Groundsmen. For most people, chaos shaping requires concentration. You can turn the chaos around you into whatever terrain you desire, but as soon as you stop concentrating, it dissolves back into soup. But a rare few people have the innate ability to shape the chaos without actively concentrating on it, and they're known as Anarchs. So what I said a moment ago is a bit misleading. You can be an Anarch without being a part of the Anarchs Guild. It's not like you get inducted into the guild the moment you discover you're an Anarch. And in fact, for reasons I'll get into in a moment, it's actually quite likely that you won't get inducted into the guild. So all members of the Anarchs Guild are Anarchs, but not all Anarchs are members of the guild. There are surely many people throughout the multiverse who are Anarchs, but don't know it, and might not ever learn it, because in order to learn it, they'd have to go to Limbo. Some people, their first time in Limbo, struggle to get the knack of chaos shaping. Some struggle so much that the chaos kills them before they figure it out. Others, though, don't even have to figure it out. Did you have to figure out breathing? I mean, I did, and I still do, but that's besides the point. An Anarch's raw talent grants them the ability to survive Limbo's chaos matter unscathed. To them, it's actually quite comfortable, just like what the Slaadi experience. It doesn't eat away at their body, and they can swim through it and even breathe it. In game terms, non-Anarchs use their intelligence rating and their concentration for chaos shaping. Though there is some inconsistency both between books and within the same book about if it's intelligence or wisdom. But this concentration is quite taxing. It takes up so much of your mental effort that you can't cast spells, make attacks, or benefit from your proficiencies or your dexterity bonus to your armor class. All they really can do is walk and talk, but even their ability to hold a conversation will be hampered. Luckily, you only need one member of your party to be concentrating at any time, but still, that's one member essentially down for the count, so it can be pretty incommodious for adventurers. Since the effectiveness of chaos shaping scales with intelligence, you're incentivized to put your most intelligent party member on the task, which is likely to be your wizard. The scaling actually gets pretty crazy. Intelligence of 1 to 4 allows you to shape the chaos around you in a 10-foot radius per point. And the terrain you can create is pretty simple, like a flat meadow. Intelligence of 5 to 10 bumps that up to a radius of 10 yards per point and allows you to create complex terrain, hills, trees, running water, for example. Intelligence of 11 to 18 bumps that to 100 yards per point and allows you to make not just natural things, but artificial ones, like buildings or streets. And an intelligence of 19 or higher bumps that to a mile per point and allows you to create complex artificial structures as well as living animals. The implications of that are rather bizarre. Are these animals facsimiles of life? Are they fully independent and new creatures that you've given life to, only for them to die confused deaths when they inevitably dissolve back into chaos matter? Are they perhaps animated by fragments of your own consciousness, so that each fox you create is actually you? And if so, when they dissolve back into chaos, does that splinter of consciousness return to your mind, or is it lost forever? And if it does return to you, do you now have that fox's memories of whatever it did while it existed? Or perhaps Limbo is a plane of panpsychism, where some small glimmer of consciousness exists within every particle, ready to coalesce into an animal at your command. I suppose, in a way, since petitioners that die in their home plane get absorbed into it, that there could be panpsychism going on in all of the planes, but it's just here that it's the most evident. Alternatively, it could be that the creatures you create are actually the still living petitioners of the plane. Perhaps, when you make an animal, you exert your will over the nearby petitioners, forcing them to cohere into a stable shape. I think these are all interesting options, so go with whichever one you like most. But back to the intelligence scaling. I just want to point out these huge spikes in radius that happen at some of these intervals. From 4 to 5 intelligence, you go from being able to shape a 40-foot radius around you to a 50-yard or 150-foot radius, a jump of 3.7 times. From 10 to 11 intelligence, you go from 100 yards to 1,100 yards, a jump of 11 times. And from 18 intelligence to 19, you go from 1,800 yards to 19 miles, which is 33,440 yards, or a jump of 18.5 times. Intelligence goes a long way in Limbo. But in 3rd edition, chaos shaping is a bit different. Here it uses wisdom instead of intelligence, but that's hardly the biggest change. The scaling is far, far reduced. A wisdom score of 4 to 7 allows for a 1-foot radius. Wisdom of 8 to 11 provides 5 feet, 12 to 15 gives 10 feet, 16 to 19 gives 15 feet, 20 to 23 gives 20 feet, and 24 and up give an extra 5 feet per 4 wisdom points. So a rating of 20 provides 20 feet in 3rd edition, compared to 100,320 feet in 2nd edition. Even at a rating of 24, you'll only get 50 feet. Though there is a change in 3rd edition that kind of makes up for this incredible reduction in radius, and that's that you don't have to maintain concentration. Instead, you make a wisdom check to control your surroundings, and if you succeed, your control lasts for as long as you stay in that area. Also, if your wisdom is at least 20, you can create a small stabilized area at the center of your zone of control that will remain even after you leave it, though it will still eventually dissolve from exposure to Limbo's chaos. But that's just 3rd edition, and that's just what normal people are capable of. 3rd edition doesn't specify what anarchs are capable of, but 2nd edition does. For anarchs, raw talent is just a starting point. Just because it comes naturally to them doesn't mean they're immediately masters at it. Many content themselves with just being able to comfortably survive the chaos broth and don't develop their abilities further. But some seek training in the ways of chaos shaping to hone their skills and become capable of true wonders. That's what the Anarchs Guild is for. Because in order for an Anarch to train their chaos shaping skills, they need to be taught by a capital A Anarch. However, the Anarchs Guild is pretty much entirely a Githzerai institution, and they're quite hesitant to teach others. So you could do some really big favor for the Githzerai, and then they'd probably agree to teach you. Or you could seek out some non-Githzerai who did that and set up a training school following the Anarchs Guild traditions, and learn from them. To the Githzerai, these aren't recognized as official branches of the guild, but you can learn from them all the same. To everyone else, anywhere that teaches chaos shaping is part of the Anarchs Guild. However, some non-Githzerai branches have bastardized the traditional teachings, and consequently, they might not actually know very much about chaos shaping at all. So beware of getting scammed. But if you do manage to find a real teacher and train in the ways of chaos shaping, there are a few benefits. For starters, for a trained Anarch, they can shape their surroundings subconsciously. They still use intelligence and conscious efforts to first shape the chaos around them, but once they set it up, they can maintain it subconsciously using their wisdom score, which is a pretty big advantage, because that means they can fight, cast spells, and even go to sleep without the world they constructed dissolving. However, it takes real mastery to be able to maintain artificial constructions without concentration, and that mastery is pretty much impossible to attain without formal induction into the Anarchs Guild. Naturally, 99% of guild members are Githzerai, though there are a select few who have done such services to their race that they're considered honorary Githzerai. But if you can accomplish that, you can learn the secret insights into chaos that allow for true mastery, allowing you to add your proficiency bonus to your intelligence and wisdom ratings when you shape chaos. So if you're level 10 with a wisdom of 20, you can subconsciously maintain a 24-mile radius landscape around you, complete with buildings, flora, and fauna. This is how the Githzerai maintain their massive cities amidst Limbo's chaos. Though even these large domains are subject to the mini-flux that I mentioned before, partially because Limbo is just too chaotic to completely control down to every little tiny detail, but also because the Anarchs don't want to control every little detail. This mini-flux means that little things tend to dissolve or to change into other things. So your possessions are your responsibility to maintain, not just to keep track of, but to keep in existence. You see, even non-Anarchs have some small ability to keep subconscious control over their surroundings. Your sword or your spellbook or your clothes are so often used and ever present that they're effectively an extension of yourself, always in the back of your mind. But the things that you don't use very often, or don't think about very much, are what fall prey to mini-flux. Like that grappling hook you haven't used since you were level 3, but is still in your inventory. Odds are, the next time you look for it, it'll be gone. Or it'll be linguini. While this is an inconvenience for adventurers, it's an even bigger problem for the residents of Limbo. Sure, you'd expect that they're well aware of mini-flux and so do their best to counteract it, but they're also likely to have a lot more objects to keep track of on account of having a home here. They can't keep every one of their possessions in the back of their mind. Sometimes, when they get home, they find that their forks are now straws, or their cupboards have turned to jelly. But still, that's better than returning home and finding that it doesn't exist at all. So, despite mini-flux, Anarchs are very highly esteemed throughout the plane, and most domains have one to keep the whole place in existence. As you can imagine, it's a pretty nice job to have. But some domains manage without them, taking shifts of concentration to maintain the domain. It's certainly a lot easier with an Anarch. You'd think a chaotic plane like Limbo would have a wide variety of weird and wacky creatures, and in some ways, it does. You can find creatures like Darkweavers, Kastas, Lilendi, Vors, Wastrels, Wraithworms, and more. But they can be found elsewhere in the planes, and for these videos I like to focus on creatures that are only found in the plane in question, or are at least more associated with it than any other plane. The animals of Limbo fall into 3 categories: those that are native, those that are chaos-shaped, and those that are transplanted. While the chaos matter can be shaped into animals, it doesn't do this naturally, and it takes quite a high intelligence rating, or wisdom, for Anarchs to do this, like genius level. So the only places you'll find regular animals are domains, or stabilized terrain, where people have purposefully brought them in from other planes. And by the way, since this animal life has been carefully and deliberately seeded into these domains, poaching in Limbo is met with extreme retribution. So that leaves the natives, which is a rather small variety. I suppose there isn't a wide variety of creatures native to Limbo because it's rather difficult to survive in the chaotic soup, and the environment is just too unstable for most life forms to have success and find an ecological niche that's reliable. This book mentions the Krakadoon, Mogwai, and Xisto, whatever they are. As far as I can tell, there's no information about any of these creatures, aside from the fact that Krakadoons are shelled, Mogwais are web-winged, and Xistos are horned, and they can all be found in the soup and stable terrain alike. But this seeming lack of variety to the native life of Limbo is pretty well made up for by the Chaos Beasts. These are in some ways 2nd edition's reimagining of the Chaos Elementals from 1st edition, but with enough differences to be quite new. Chaos Elementals were horrific conglomerations of petitioner spirits, with tusks, or tentacles, or hooves, or whatever random assortment of terrifying parts. Chaos Beasts, on the other hand, are beings of their own. They are not petitioners. They're beings of pure instability. They take on a vast multitude of forms, often horrific and ungainly, but sometimes beautiful and graceful, and sometimes looking more like animals than you would expect. A towering horror of hooks and fangs, pulpy flesh and exposed veins on 3 legs. A slithering mass of ropey tentacles, its body topped with 10 eyes and a sack surrounded by mouths and useless fluttering wings. A smooth and elegant creature, the color of the sun, on 6 legs striding nobly through the primordial soup. A piteous creature with a body like fallen dough hanging over splintered bone, stumps for feet, crab-like hands, and empty eye sockets. A steaming tangle of fat tumbling about, a body like a sack of flaccid sausages. Chaos Beasts can take all of these forms and more, and they don't keep these forms for long either. A Chaos Beast is the culmination of all possibilities. It may change as you look at it, or it may remain stable for a day, but not for longer. These creatures are widely feared throughout all of Limbo, though not because of their fearsome appearance or capacity to kill. No matter how fearsome a Chaos Beast appears in any given transformation, they aren't capable of doing much physical harm. A Chaos Beast with terrible claws and powerful muscles hits you, and it feels rather like a wet noodle, limp and yielding, like a half-filled water skin. The force of their attacks is capable of doing a little damage, but the true threat is the simple touch of their flesh, which triggers a magical transformation known as corporeal instability if you fail a saving throw. Actually, it's not quite their touch that causes it. It's a bit worse than that. It's as if their bodies emanate an aura a short distance, because you're still at risk if you touch them through clothing, and even if you make a melee attack with a weapon. But the risk is reduced for each degree of separation, so the saving throw is easier to succeed, up to no risk if you attack them at range. And any Chaos Beast flesh removed from their body instantly loses this power. But if the corporeal instability sets in, your body is suddenly stricken by a soft sponginess as it begins to lose all form. It melts, flows, writhes, and boils. Your hands have no grip, so you can't attack or hold items. Your feet go soft and contort into impossible shapes, so your movement is far reduced. Anything you are wearing becomes a hindrance as your body expands, reducing your dexterity. It causes no physical damage, but a shearing psychic pain shoots through you, preventing you from acting coherently, casting spells, or distinguishing friend from foe. In game terms, each round you're afflicted by corporeal instability, you make a saving throw. If you fail, you lose 1 point of wisdom. And if your wisdom reaches 0, you become a mindless, bodiless horror. And a popular theory among the inhabitants of Limbo is that you eventually become a Chaos Beast yourself, able to infect others with corporeal instability. But succeeding on a saving throw, finding the mental strength to resist, returns your body to normal, for a short time anyway, as corporeal instability is permanent. Your body has already betrayed you, so from now on you must maintain concentration to keep it from destabilizing once more. So essentially, you have to chaos shape yourself. Luckily though, others can keep your body intact for you with their own concentration, which means that you can sleep. But still, you'll be cursed like this forever, unless you can find a cure. There are some spells that can provide temporary relief. For instance, Shape Change or Stone Skin can stave off the corporeal instability for as long as the spell lasts. But to actually be cured requires high-level magic like a heal or limited wish spell. Chaos Beasts are solitary creatures, and they seem to move about the plane randomly, though they don't like stabilized regions, so you thankfully don't have to worry about them encroaching on your domain. It's the wild places in between these pockets of order that you've got to worry about. Another troublesome creature native to Limbo are the Chaos Imps. These imps are typically about 2 feet tall and rather monkey-like in proportion, but aside from that, there's little consistency between them. And just like the Chaos Beasts, there's little consistency within the same imp. Their faces and their features change to suit their moods or their needs. Their favorite activity, really what they seem to live for, is to infest objects and spread chaos throughout the other planes. If a Chaos Imp touches an object, it can possess it, essentially disappearing into the item, becoming completely undetectable. So they like to find people, and ideally unawares, possess their items, preferably durable or important items like weapons, shields, and armor, rather than expendable or flimsy items like scrolls or clothing. Then they like to lie dormant until the person who's unwittingly carrying them around leaves Limbo, so that they can spread chaos, because the only way a Chaos Imp can leave the plane is inside an object. They can spread chaos in a few ways. For one thing, they can speak from within the item, leading someone to believe they're in possession of a sentient sword or something, or just generally causing confusion, like if you don't know where the voice is coming from, or perhaps waiting until you're in a room with an important person and yelling, "Hey jackass," when their back is turned. They also have the power to transform the item, so they might infest your sword, and in a moment of need, you reach for it and find that it's turned into a bowl of pudding. Alternatively, they might pop out of the item to cause chaos in person. Maybe they pull your pants down and push you off a cliff, and then speed away to go infest a new item. But while off Limbo, they eventually dissipate if they're not possessing an object. Some people believe that Chaos Imps aren't truly living creatures, but rather lifeless manifestations of Limbo's chaos that pop into existence only to fizzle out again. And they do seem to just spring into existence. In Limbo, Chaos Imps are always found in nests, inert bubbles just floating in the chaos matter. When a suitable host comes within range, a bunch of imps materialize out of the bubble. Others, though, think that Chaos Imps are the proxies, or servants, of the gods of Limbo, with the mission of spreading the dominion of chaos to the other planes. Because their top priority is to escape Limbo, a decent way to get rid of them, if you suspect your gear has been infested by Chaos Imps, is to convince them that you've left the plane. Then they'll reveal themselves after a little while. Of course, you've immediately got a new problem, because they'll quickly realize they're still in Limbo and will just possess your stuff again. And fighting them isn't normally a good solution, because as soon as your weapon makes contact, they can just slip inside it. So really, you've just gotta run. Another creature native to Limbo is the Chaos Dragon. They, for the most part, look like dragons, with clawed limbs, great wings, a long serpentine neck, a mouth full of dagger-like teeth, and a jagged tail. But no two Chaos Dragons look alike. And I take this to mean that there are quite large differences between them, because otherwise it would just be a rather uninteresting statement, as there are variations within any species, not just Chaos Dragons. Though a bit like the Chaos Beast and Chaos Imps, many people claim that even the same Chaos Dragon changes its form over time. Chaos Dragons seek to tear down structured societies and civilizations. So unlike Chaos Beasts, they are a threat to those stabilized domains all over the plane. Though while Chaos Dragons are always chaotic, they can be good, neutral, or evil. So the way they'll try to disassemble societies will vary pretty widely. Good Chaos Dragons might prefer to persuade people to disorganize, while evil ones will just go in there and try to murder everybody. Chaos Dragons have two types of breath attacks. One that emits energy beams of a random type of energy, and one that emits confusion gas. The final type of creature native to Limbo, and by far the most numerous and most dominant, are the Slaadi. The Githzerai and the Slaadi are the two dominant races of Limbo. But while the Githzerai might be so firmly entrenched here that they might seem like natives, they've really only been here for a few thousand years. The Slaadi, on the other hand, are the true natives, seemingly having been here as long as the plane itself has. Each of the major outer planes has what you could call a signature race, a race that's dominant and representative of the nature of the plane, at least in theory. For Limbo, that's the Slaadi. I find myself typically calling them Slaad, whether singular or plural, but that's not right. The plural is either Slaads or Slaadi, depending on the source. Since 2nd edition prefers Slaadi, that's what I'll use. And take a shot every time I say Slaadi, you'll be dead in 30 seconds. Slaadi are basically giant, carnivorous, bipedal frog people. Giant for frogs, not as much for people. Their heads are pretty big though, and so are their claws, and they're actually quite tall, so kinda giant. Slaadi should not be confused with the other frog creature, the Hezru, which are a type of demon. Slaadi come in various types, falling into a strict hierarchy, which is kind of surprising given that they're the representative race of chaos. But like how I talked about near the beginning of the video, Slaad society isn't hierarchical because Slaadi loves structure. It's hierarchical because they have a reverence for individual strength. Slaadi find it only natural that a stronger creature should have control over a weaker creature. And it helps that if the weaker creature did try to rebel, they'd just get killed by the stronger one. And the weaker one knows that, so there's reverence and fear. Since they're beings of chaos, they have a strong sense of individualism. So strong that they don't really even think to work together, which means that it doesn't even enter a Slaad's head that if it works together with its fellows, it could overthrow its superior. So Slaad society is probably still rather messy, with no sense of organization or cooperation within each rank. Just a cluster of weak Slaadi that all independently submit to the demands of a stronger Slaad. And 1st edition makes it a bit more messy, as instead of this reverence for power and the natural inclination to submit to more powerful creatures, Slaad society is organized purely through force and the threat of it. So any semblance of control a particular Slaad can exert only goes as far as they can reach. This same lack of organization and cooperation skills makes for a rather peculiar situation when the Slaadi fight. If you're a lifelong lover of video games, like me, you'll probably have played many games where the enemies cluster around you, but fight you one at a time, while the others just watch and wait their turn, very politely. The lack of realism and the stupidity of the enemy has always annoyed me in games like this, but that's exactly how the Slaadi behave. They never cooperate. So 4 Slaadi against 1 adventurer becomes 1 Slaad against 1 adventurer 4 times in a row. You might think the observing Slaadi would back down after watching the first one get killed, because they respect power and they just witnessed that you're more powerful than they are. But, like every 22-year-old male who imagines they'll become a billionaire, they think they're different. Every Slaadi has the "I'm not like the other girls" mentality, so it doesn't sink in that you're more powerful than them until you beat them personally. Which, on the one hand, certainly makes it easier for the adventurer than dealing with them all at once, but on the other hand, it can get real annoying and real exhausting to have to prove to each and every single Slaad that you're more powerful than they are. But when it's multiple Slaadi versus multiple adventurers, the fight plays out a bit more normally, with each Slaad targeting a different adventurer. However, when I say normal, I don't mean logical. Just like the silly design of overly polite enemies in video games who wait their turn to attack you, it seems like many DMs pilot their enemies in this same sort of way, where they spread out the damage equally between players, likely to avoid killing any of them. But this, in the vast majority of cases, is not how enemies would actually behave. They would be intelligent enough to focus fire on one target at a time to most quickly gain the advantage in the action economy, just as you would. But for Slaadi, it makes perfect sense for the DM to pilot them like dumbuses. And they don't run away either, because that misplaced sense of their own individual strength leads a Slaad to believe that even if you kill all its friends, it'll still win in the end. And since they do revere strength, if you best a Slaad without killing it, it'll view you as a superior. So maybe it'll follow your orders, or maybe it'll go find some even more powerful Slaad to find out who's more powerful between you. Slaadi have the same natural ability to comfortably survive Limbo's primordial soup as Anarchs do. They can breathe it, swim through it, and it doesn't burn away at their flesh. They like to follow chaos storms through the plane that drag debris of various landscapes in their wake, providing a temporary environment for them to inhabit, not that they need it. Unlike Anarchs, they don't exert their will over the plane to form stable environments. They prefer to live in the raw chaos, whatever form it may take, roaming around the whole plane, taking whatever they need as they go. Along the same lines as their respect for power, their philosophy is similar to the Fated, a faction of Sigil. If I can take it, it's mine. While they might come by and steal your food or your children or whatever, they don't have much use for collecting personal possessions. They don't just stay in Limbo, though. One thing you can often find them doing is scavenging the battlefields of the Blood War, eating the dead and bringing the wounded back to makeshift camps to inject them with eggs. Slaadi have no respect for anything other than their own race, viewing all other creatures as nothing more than beasts to be used or eaten as they see fit. They can't be reasoned with, bargained with, or bribed, and appeals for mercy certainly aren't going to do anything. They speak their own language, though they can speak with other races through telepathy. In 4th edition, this all goes a bit further. They don't just see all other creatures as beasts, but they believe that they are the only sentient creatures in existence. So to them, everything in the multiverse is essentially on the same level as a sea sponge, a plant, or a bacterium. All signs of sentience are just illusions, basically, as if the entire world was populated by mindless robots programmed to put on a convincing display of having minds of their own. But the Slaadi are not convinced. They see through it all. And so why treat other creatures well or care about their existence if they're not even real? This philosophy is like a collective version of metaphysical solipsism. Solipsism is the idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. Anything beyond that can be doubted. René Descartes' classic, "I think, therefore I am," except pretty much stopping there. Metaphysical solipsism takes that a step further and says that the only thing that does exist is one's own mind. This is pretty much the most individualist philosophy a person can possibly have. So it's fitting that something like it would turn up in the most chaotic, and therefore most individualistic, plane. However, the Slaadi seem to have no issue accepting the legitimate sentience of other Slaadi. Perhaps, to a certain degree, Slaadi perceive other Slaadi to not really be other, but to be extensions of themselves. Although with their difficulties of working together, and with the animosity that exists between certain types of Slaadi, if it is true, it's not consistent. And I guess, no matter how you slice it, their worldview isn't as individualistic as it could be. Most people, inhabiting their own existence, thinking their own thoughts, believing themselves to be real, would disagree with the Slaadi, and find them crazy for not believing that others are sentient. And while most Slaadi do come off as insane, Part of this is due to their distracted nature, like they're aware of things that other creatures can't perceive. Maybe those are just hallucinations, or maybe they can see things more clearly than everyone else. Maybe they're right. In the Planescape books, there are 5 types of Slaadi, but taking all sources into account, there's 8. Each type of Slaad is more powerful than the next, and you can tell them apart by their color. However, one thing I find weird is that this passage of this box set contradicts that, saying that the power levels of Slaadi are denoted by the color of their forehead markings. But then elsewhere in this same box set, it says the body color thing. So I wonder if these sections were written by different people, or at different times and they changed their mind about the forehead thing but forgot to change it in the text? Or if in that section it was intended for these forehead markings to be changeable, meaning that a red Slaad, for example, could ascend up the ranks rather than being a red Slaad its whole life. That would strike me as being more fitting for Limbo than the almost completely rigid, birth-based caste system described elsewhere. But the rigid, color-based caste system is how it works, as plenty of other books confirm. However, the forehead marking thing is still a part of Slaad culture, just not by color. Their past achievements and status are tattooed into their heads. But I'm not so sure I'm a fan of this, because while this isn't spelled out anywhere, I would think that would lead to even more rigidity in their caste system. Because not only would you have differentiation between different types of Slaadi, but you'd have differentiation within the types of Slaadi. So rather than chaos within each rank, you'd have orderliness, as it would be clear based off the tattoos which member of the same rank is stronger. Although it could be that the other Slaadi of the same type don't care about the forehead tattoos of others, and these markings just serve as indicators to the Slaadi above them. I guess that would make sense. If you've got an army of frog people at your disposal, it would certainly help to sort them. In 1st edition, instead of forehead markings, they have jewels or gems encased in their foreheads underneath their skin. Each gem is unique to each Slaad and contains the Slaad's life force. If you manage to get a hold of this jewel, you can control the Slaad by threatening to destroy the crystal and force it to perform 3 requests, at least as far as they're able. And they'll most likely try to kill you once they get their gem back, unless you pay them really well. In 5th edition, these Slaad control gems are a bit different. Rather than using them as leverage for extortion, the gems can be used to magically subjugate them, as a Slaad must obey whoever possesses its gem. And the gems don't hold their life essence, so if a Slaad's gem is destroyed, all that means is that it can no longer be used to control them. The weakest and most common variety are the red Slaadi, also called blood Slaadi. While they are the lowest form of Slaad, they're still powerful 8-foot-tall creatures, if not very intelligent. They are ruthless and travel in large packs, although 3rd edition disagrees and says they're rather solitary. They have an intense hatred for the blue Slaadi, which is the next variety up the hierarchy. It does seem like a bit of a contradiction that red Slaadi hate blue Slaadi rather than revere them, if the blue Slaadi are more powerful than they are. I guess their respect for power has some exceptions, which I suppose does make them a bit more chaotic. But no matter their hatred, the red and blue Slaadi are inextricably intertwined in their reproduction cycle, as the red create the blue and the blue create the red. Red Slaadi have a gland under each of their claws that they can use to imperceptibly inject an egg pellet into whoever they attack, at least if the target fails a saving throw, though if the target is unconscious, the red Slaadi's implantation succeeds automatically. The egg pellet moves through the victim's body until it reaches the chest cavity, where it gestates for 3 months as a tadpole before bursting out of the victim's chest, killing them and eating their body. Then it feeds on whatever other meat it can find while it transforms into a fully grown blue Slaad over the course of up to 24 hours. That's 5th edition, though. In 3rd edition, the gestation takes just a week. In 2nd edition, there are no Slaad tadpoles. Instead, the egg pellet gestates into a baby blue Slaad that eats its way out of the chest cavity, and it takes a few years to grow to adulthood. Either way, though, 24 hours before the victim's chest fatally gives birth to a Slaad, they fall violently ill. With a spell such as Remove Curse, you can destroy the Slaad while it's still gestating. This is why Slaadi typically drag their tadpole hosts off to prison camps, so nothing interrupts the gestation. These camps are usually set up near battlefields, because these are sites littered with the wounded, who make easy injection targets. Then, when the tadpoles emerge, the Slaadi disperse again. Blue Slaadi, also called Talon Slaadi, are the next up the hierarchy. and they're substantially stronger than the red, although that's just in 2nd edition. They're 10 feet tall and have 2 long, sharp bone rakes protruding from the back of each hand that they can use to infect their victims with a disease known as Chaos Phage, that after 3 months transforms them into a red Slaad. It's undetectable in the first month, except through the use of magic like a Detect Evil spell. But after that, it becomes pretty obvious what's happening, and it can be treated with something like Cure Disease, which was a 3rd level spell in 2nd edition. Just like the red Slaadi, the blue Slaadi prevent this by keeping their infected victims prisoner until the transformation is complete. And once it is complete, nothing short of a wish spell can turn you back. Since the blue spawn the red and the red spawn the blue, and they don't like each other, rather than look after their own victims, they look after the victims of the other kind of Slaad. A red Slaad is instinctually driven to inject its eggs into a host and imprison it in a spawning layer. But once it does, it no longer cares if that tadpole lives or dies. But it does apparently care if the blue Slaadi's victims, the soon-to-be red Slaadi, survive. In 3rd edition, the transformation disease the blue Slaadi infect is called Slaad Fever, and its duration depends on a few things. Each day you make a saving throw, and if you fail, you take 1d3 damage to your dexterity and charisma. And once your charisma reaches 0, the transformation happens. In 4th edition, most types of Slaadi use their claws to implant tadpoles into living creatures, not just the red ones. The resulting disease is known as Chaos Phage, so here it's not just the disease of the blue Slaadi. And rather than becoming ill before the tadpole bursts out, the victim succumbs to madness, and the tadpole bursts out of the skull rather than the chest. Sometimes, rather than infecting hosts directly, the Slaadi will set loose a giant clump of oversized embryos called a Chaos Phage swarm to drift throughout Limbo, causing chaos and destruction and breeding more Slaadi in its wake. Sometimes the victims of the red and blue Slaadi produce green Slaadi instead, also called Curse Slaadi, the next rank up the hierarchy. In 2nd edition, this has a chance of happening whenever the host is rather powerful or high level. In 5th edition, this happens whenever the host is someone capable of casting 3rd level or higher spells. Because the green Slaadi are more powerful than either the red or blue, and there's no antagonistic relationship with the greens, they view it as a rather auspicious occasion when one of their victims produces a green Slaad, and they nurture them carefully, which takes about 10 to 12 years. Green Slaadi live for hundreds of years, are tremendously arrogant and self-centered, even by Slaadi standards, and are more intelligent than the red and blue varieties. They're spellcasters, and prefer to use those powers over brute force. They have the ability to shapeshift at will into a copy of the humanoid host that spawned them. While red and blue Slaadi seemingly have no way to move up Slaadi society, the green is the level of the hierarchy where that becomes possible. Though it's worth noting that this source seems to imply that all varieties of Slaadi can ascend the ranks in the same kind of way that the green can. When green Slaadi get to be at least a century old, sometimes they withdraw into isolation in the deep wilderness of Limbo. Most of them are never seen again, but some return after a year or more as gray Slaadi, also called Rift Slaadi. They're quite intelligent, are even better spellcasters than the greens, and are also capable of shapeshifting into their original host. While Slaadi don't usually participate in the eternal blood war between the Beatezu and Tanari, except to scavenge battlefields and use them as breeding grounds, gray Slaadi have been known to trade intelligence to either side in exchange for powerful magic items, because they're fascinated by power and magic, apparently seeking the near immortality of the most powerful type, the Death Slaadi. Death Slaadi achieve their incredible power and longevity through evil ceremonies. They have genius-level intelligence and are very rare, with this book claiming that only 6 of them are known to exist. Some sources, such as 3rd and 5th edition, make Death Slaadi chaotic evil and say that they're extremely sadistic killing machines. Not exemplars of chaos, but rather of evil's corruption of it. They work to propagate their race, marshalling mobs of red and blue Slaadi to invade villages in the lower plains and turn them into incubation camps. All of the types of Slaadi have the ability to gate in other Slaadi twice per day with a certain success rate, the type of Slaad summoned and the success rate both improving as you go up the ranks. But for Death Slaadi, this ability is crazy. It's not twice per day, it's once per turn. It always succeeds, and it summons up to 8 Slaadi of any variety except other Death Slaadi. So if you get into a fight with a Death Slaad, it may never end. Each turn, the Death Slaad can gate in 8 Grey Slaadi, who each can attempt to gate in 4 more Grey Slaadi, who can all do the same thing. Each Grey Slaadi can only do this twice, and there's a 60% chance of success each time, but still, that math is looking pretty brutal. Though keep in mind that in 2nd edition, a turn is not the same thing as a round. It's 10 minutes of game time. But I suppose with the Slaad attitude of thinking they're the best, they would probably save gating in other Slaadi as a last resort. In fact, this book says that the fear and distrust that Slaadi have for each other means they only use this power to save their own lives. But still, if you're in a fight to the death with a Slaad, that means they're going to use it. Death Slaadi, at least in the 2nd edition books, are the greatest of their kind. If you want a comparison, they're on the same level as Pit Fiends and Balors. Though in 5th edition, Slaadi get a huge downgrade, and not just the Death Slaadi. Red Slaadi are CR 5, blue are CR 7, green are CR 8, gray are CR 9, and death are CR 10. Balors in 5th edition are CR 19, and Pit Fiends are CR 20. Slaadi were done dirty. It's obviously hard to compare the power level of monsters between editions, but it seems like they were weakened going into 3rd edition, then weakened again in 5th edition. But while the Death Slaadi are positioned in 2nd edition as basically the pinnacle of Slaad society, there are actually a few more varieties. 3rd edition adds white and black Slaadi. White Slaadi, also called Chronos Slaadi, ascend from Death Slaadi in the same sort of way that the greens ascend to greys. A Death Slaad that survives for more than a century retreats into isolation for at least a year, returning in a larger, stronger, white form. They are substantially more powerful than the Death Slaadi of this same edition, at CR 21 compared to CR 13. 4th edition gives them some power over time, thus the name Chronos Slaadi. Then, a white Slaad that survives for more than a century undergoes the same process, and when it returns, is now a black Slaad, also called a Void Slaad, because they don't even have a body anymore, and instead are toad-shaped voids in space with 2 evil gleaming eyes, though they're usually chaotic neutral. So I guess the evil of the Death Slaadi was just a phase. And the true pinnacle of Slaaddom, who have existed in D&D since the Fiend Folio of 1981, but aren't really mentioned much in the Planescape books for whatever reason, are the Slaad Lords. These are the Slaad equivalent of the Archfiends of the lower planes, or the Celestial Paragons of the upper planes, or of Primus of Mechanus. As Slaadi advance from green to gray to death, they gain more and more freedom on account of their increased power, and thus the difficulty of other creatures to force them into submission. Some Death Slaadi seek to free themselves completely from the stultifying structure inherent in this supposedly chaotic race, and take on a mysterious and extremely perilous process of exploration and investigation into an aspect of chaos that they wish to embody, and from which to draw immense power. If they succeed, they become a Slaad Lord, a being of near godlike power. And I guess in 3rd and 4th edition, that would instead be the Black Slaadi who take on this pursuit. Or perhaps any Slaad of death rank or above could do it. Slaad Lords are personifications of chaos, or a unique aspect of it for each Lord, and their physical forms vary widely, as they don't necessarily look anything like the other Slaadi, though some do. There are 8 known Slaad Lords: Yegorul, Sendam, Korst, Renbu, Bazim Gorag, Ure-Nas, Norsar, and Wardle. Yegorul, Lord of Entropy, is considered to be the ruler of Limbo, at least to those that even know of him in the first place, which is mostly just the Slaadi, as Yegorul is quite reclusive and secretive. And while I did say that a reason a Slaad may seek to become a Slaad Lord is specifically because they wish to escape the hierarchy, the other Slaad Lords seem to be fine with Yegorul being the ruler. Probably because they're uninterested in ruling anything, and because Yegorul doesn't really make demands of them. So it may be fair to say that Yegorul's rulership doesn't really mean much for the other Slaad Lords, and maybe even for a lot of the rest of the Slaadi, because as I said before, in Limbo, your control over others only goes so far as you can reach. So any Slaad who doesn't believe that they're personally in danger of Yegorul's retribution might not care what he has to say, at least depending on what version of Slaad psychology we use. Yegorul looks like a 12-foot-tall, black, shadowy, somewhat Slaad-like skeleton with bat wings, wielding a giant sickle which instantly kills anyone struck by it, unless they succeed on a saving throw. Yagorl has an ancient brass dragon named Shkiv that he rides around, and he keeps a fortress that constantly changes to suit his whims, and anyone attempting to flee from it finds that all corridors lead wherever he wants them to lead. Though in 1st edition his domain is a series of interlaced carved spheres. As the Lord of Entropy, Yagorl seeks to spread death, decay, and disorganization through the multiverse, and he mainly does this by spreading the Slaadi as far as he can. The Death Slaadi that direct the mass spawnings on the Blood War battlefields do this on Yagorl's behalf. Though Yagorl's other main goal is to maintain secrecy, he discourages the notion that the Slaad Lords are gods, even if they pretty much are, and tries to keep all information of them as sparse as possible. He also seeks to keep the number of Slaad Lords as low as he can, to the point that he finds and devours Death Slaadi who are close to becoming Slaad Lords. Though despite this, Yagorl is grooming one Death Slaad to become a Slaad Lord in the near future, Sorrel, who will be the Lord of Anarchy, breaking down lawful societies through espionage, sabotage, and terrorism. In 4th edition, Slaad legends say that Yagorl came into existence when the multiverse ended, and is now moving backward through time, until his death at the beginning of time. Having already seen the end of all things, he feels no need to bring it about quickly, and instead weakens the fabric of reality slowly to ensure that the future he has lived through comes to pass. While Yagorl is the leader, Sendam, Lord of Insanity, is the oldest and most powerful Slaad Lord. In some sources described as a he, in others a she. I think it makes more sense to call Sendam an it, and perhaps all Slaadi for that matter, as they don't really have gender. But Sendam especially so, because Sendam is a huge golden amoeba with 3 pseudopods, or 4 depending on the source, and a brain instead of a nucleus. Sometimes Sendam takes on other forms, such as a humanoid when in the prime material plane, or a huge golden Slaad when near the spawning stone, which I'll talk about in a bit. Sendam sees insanity as the perfect expression of chaos, and doesn't really care about anything aside from spreading it, and is always contacting the minds of mortals on other planes, rendering them mad. It's thought that the psychic trauma of the insane makes Sendam more powerful. Korst, Lord of Randomness, is the 3rd Slaad Lord. He takes the shape of a gangly, 20-foot tall, chalk-white Slaad. He ventures to other planes from time to time to wreak havoc, but most of the time he's in limbo because he finds the primal soup to be soothing. He emanates an aura that dissolves all chaos matter into its brothy form within a 30-foot radius, and his touch inflicts corporeal instability, the same as a chaos beast. Though when he touches a Modron, they immediately become a rogue Modron. In fact, he once paid the plane of Mechanus a visit, causing such mayhem and disorder that Primus himself had to show up to stop him. Korst's only desire is to indiscriminately indulge in his every random whim, which more often than not tend to be destructive, as he lacks the focus and discipline to actually build anything. One of his favorite activities is to use his dissolving aura to cannonball through the stabilized domains of Limbo. The holes that he makes tend to linger for a while, resistant to future chaos shaping for a time. Renbu, Lord of Colors, is the newest of the Slaad Lords, at least according to one source. He's a flamboyant and stylish 12-foot tall, gaunt Slaad with a mane of white hair and radiant skin that constantly changes color. He's sometimes said to be the most cruel, sadistic, and maliciously capricious Slaad Lord of them all. But honestly, I don't really see how this can be true, considering his main activity is to go around changing the colors of things, either temporarily or permanently. Sure, he often likes to change colors in whatever way might cause the most harm, like by turning a red dragon gold, fooling people into thinking it's good. But still, I imagine with most things, having their color changed just results in mild annoyance or artistic distaste. Maybe now you just have to deal with the fact that your house is hot pink for the rest of your life, and there's nothing you can do to change it. Though Renbu isn't all about harm and mischief. He's quite the accomplished artist himself. His fortress is a grand gallery deep in Limbo where he keeps all his works of art, or any that he's found in his travels that he finds pleasing. It's staffed by red and blue Slaadi, in the hopes that if they please their lord, he'll change their color. Because when Renbu changes the color of a Slaad, they actually transform into that type of Slaad. The green, gray, and death Slaadi try to avoid him, because they're more worried he'd turn them into a lesser color than they are hopeful of being turned into a greater one. Basim Gorag, the Firebringer, is a Slaad lord who looks like a hulking, two-headed toad creature with red gold skin, wielding a glaive of black iron wreathed in dark flame. He hungers to spread chaos through destruction, murder, and fire. Though he can't really do that as he's been imprisoned in Faerun for about 2,000 years. However, there is a cult known as the Acolytes of the Hidden Flame that seek to free him, and there's an adventure all about it in a Dungeon magazine issue from 2003. Some sources make him out to have been originally not a Slaad, but a Batraki, which are different toad creatures but native to the Forgotten Realms. Ure Nas is another Slaad lord, though not a lot is known about her. She looks like a grotesquely bloated Slaad, too obese to use her legs, her tongue dangling to scrape along the ground. She was the former consort of Ramanos, god of the Bullywugs, and rather than residing in Limbo, she's the ruler of the 53rd layer of the Abyss, the Phage breeding grounds, which is actually formed from Ramanos' rotting carcass. The layer is filled with half-conscious thralls partially entombed in the walls and injected with Slaad eggs. Though this information comes from 4th edition, where the elemental chaos takes the place of Limbo, and the Abyss is part of the elemental chaos. Norsar the Many-Colored is another Slaad lord with little information to go on. Really just the fact that he has translucent skin and can pull many versions of himself from across time into the present to form his own army. Wardle is the final Slaad lord. He's a short and bloated Slaad with grayish-brown skin with spots of sickly green. He also sometimes takes on the form of a short, pudgy human who appears inept and cowardly, though this appearance is misleading. Whatever form he takes, his body is profusely speckled with warts. He's flippant, whimsical, inconsistent, crude, and a great liar. He often insults the other Slaad lords, and often gets on their bad side. Like that one time Yagorl turned him into a meteorite and sent him crashing into the 7 heavens of Mount Celestia, in the hope that the plane would kill him. There are many origin stories and creation myths for the Slaadi. Some believe that they've always existed in Limbo. Perhaps they're manifestations of the plane itself. Some believe that they're descendants of a group of Batraki that ventured into the Outer Planes long ago. Others think that Slaadi have some common history with demons, either that demons are corrupted Slaadi, or that Slaadi were once demons that broke free of the influence of the Abyss. Another prominent story says that long ago, Primus, the leader of the Modrons, created a gigantic stone imbued with the power of law, and cast it into Limbo with the intent of bringing order to the chaos of the plane. According to this story, this stone is what makes chaos shaping possible, allowing for ordered environments to arise. So it was at least partially successful in its intended effect. But it had one, presumably unforeseen, side effect. The chaotic energy absorbed by the stone spawned the horrors that came to be known as the Slaadi, so it's called the Spawning Stone. And this could explain why the structure of Slaadi society is more ordered than otherwise might be expected. And the Spawning Stone is also what's responsible for the presence of those Slaad control gems in their foreheads. A Slaad whose forehead doesn't have one, perhaps because it was destroyed, will gain a new one when they go back to the stone. This actually isn't just a story, but is canon in 5th edition. In 2nd edition, there's a different canon. The Slaadi, as they're currently known to exist, are not the true Slaadi. True Slaadi are beings of ultimate chaos, whose forms follow no set pattern. So they don't fall into a set of neatly defined colors, and they don't necessarily look like frog people at all, like the Slaad lords. But back in the earliest days of Slaadi history, when Sendam and Yagorl became the first Slaad lords, they didn't want to have to contend with a Slaad that, by sheer random mutation, was more powerful than they were. So they altered the Spawning Stone itself, which is basically a holy site where the Slaadi go to fertilize their embryos, limiting the Slaad race to the handful of forms they now take. Though due to the chaotic nature of the Slaadi, true Slaadi are sometimes still born, and these mutants are hidden away in secret nurseries. Whether they're hidden from the Slaad lords or by them is anyone's guess. So in this story, the Spawning Stone predates the modern Slaadi, though I suppose it's possible that both this and the 5th edition story are true, that Primus created the Spawning Stone, and the first Slaadi that arose from it were randomly shaped mutants, until the first Slaad lords ordered the race to make them easier to rule. And by the way, the Spawning Stone is responsible for yet another type of Slaad, the Gormeal. Gormeal Slaadi are true mutants in all ways. They look rather different, though still reptilian. like massive, apish, four-legged lizard people. But more importantly, they're lawful neutral, which just goes to show that in a truly random environment, even lawfulness is produced sometimes. Gormeal are natural enemies of the rest of the Slaadi, and can often be found allied with Githzerai, serving as their mounts in combat. Even among the Slaadi, there are countless origin stories, most of them contradicting each other, fitting for a chaotic race. One prominent belief among the Slaadi is that they were the first beings to inhabit the multiverse, predating even the gods. This makes sense with their belief that they're the only truly sentient beings in the multiverse. Everything that came after them is just a pale imitation of the consciousness that they possess. Or perhaps the Slaadi themselves thought all other beings into existence. Some sages believe that the fact that the countless origin stories the Slaadi have contradict each other invalidates them all. But another theory holds that all of their origin stories are actually true, because each story comes from a different reality. Two Slaadi might tell completely different creation myths because they're descended from two completely separate universes, and that at some point in the past, all these realities collapsed into one. Only the Slaadi remember the infinite possibilities of other timelines, and now they're trapped in a single reality, and their main motivation is to sow enough chaos to break free into the wider multiverse once more. Perhaps this is why Slaadi always seem so distracted and insane, because they can see into multiple realities at once. Their pursuit of chaos is ultimately the attempt to tear down the walls between universes. Perhaps they follow the chaos storms that rage throughout the plane because they believe the barriers between realities are thinnest at the storm's center. I like the Slaadi as a race. I think they're fun, and I think they're interesting. But I don't think I necessarily like the Slaadi as a race for Limbo. I don't think they're chaotic enough, and I think they're too evil. As I said in the beginning of the video, being chaotic in D&D is mostly about individual freedom, but I think if there was going to be a race that embodied the randomness aspect of it present in the earlier edition definitions of chaos, I think it should be the Slaadi. If I were to rewrite the Slaadi, it would look something like this. The Death Slaadi can still be pretty much evil, but the race as a whole is balanced out by a good counterpart, like a Life Slaadi, who like to go around randomly helping people. And to make the race as a whole more chaotic, each time a Slaad goes to sleep, it transforms into a different type of Slaad, perhaps with a 40% chance of being a red Slaad, a 25% chance of being a blue Slaad, a 15% chance of being a green Slaad, a 10% chance of being a gray Slaad, a 5% chance of being a Death Slaad, and a 5% chance of being a Life Slaad, forgetting about the white and black Slaad. Let's just say they don't exist. And it can still be that weaker Slaadi follow stronger Slaadi. So if there's a group of Slaadi led by a Death Slaad, they'll go around killing people for fun. But then the next day they all transform, and maybe one of them is a Life Slaad, so now they go around helping people for fun. If you've got no Life or Death Slaadi one day, then perhaps the Gray Slaadi are the morally Gray Slaadi, and like to do a bit of good and bad, like Sour Patch Kids. If a Green Slaad is in charge, perhaps it just goes about on random and frequently changing whims, completely unmotivated by good or evil. If a Blue Slaad is in charge, perhaps it goes around looking for a more powerful Slaad elsewhere to lead its troop. If you somehow end up with only Red Slaadi, perhaps they're so disorganized that they achieve nothing of any consequence, or are completely unable to make up their minds about who should lead them, changing leaders every couple minutes. And if you end up with multiple Slaadi in the highest rank of the group, then the group splinters. I like this idea because it makes Slaad society completely chaotic and ever-changing. Large groups fracture into small groups, which coalesce again into large groups. All the while, the behavior of these groups is erratic and unpredictable. One day, a horde of Slaadi come to your city led by a Death Slaad, and you're screwed. And then they sack your city and spend the night. And the next day, they're led by a Life Slaad, who resurrects all the people they just killed yesterday. Then they all become Red Slaadi and just sit around painting the walls and paving the streets with cornmeal. And then the next day, they're led by a Green Slaad who turns the city into a biscuit factory, but then gets bored of that and leaves. And on an individual level, it would be pretty amusing too. One day, you're a Red Slaad who's just happy to be following the horde of chaos, and then you wake up, and you're now incredibly powerful and the leader of your troop. You wake up again, and now you're back to being a humble Red Slaad, and the day before feels like a fever dream. Or it could be that within each Slaad, there are 6 personalities. One for each type of Slaad they might turn into on any given day, with no memories shared between them.
and that could be pretty fun for players to interact with. You capture a gray Slaad with the intent of getting information out of it, but then while in captivity, it transforms into a blue Slaad and is basically a completely different person, without any idea of what you're talking about, until it turns into a gray Slaad again. But basically, what I'm saying is, I get that even chaotic creatures can form societies and fall into hierarchies, but the Slaadi just feel a bit too orderly for the plane of ultimate chaos. And a good explanation for why is the origin story where Primus created them in an attempt to order Limbo, but that still doesn't explain why they're so evil. Especially the Death Slaadi, who literally become Death Slaadi by engaging in, quote, evil ceremonies. However, the Slaad belief that they're the only sentient beings in existence could also help to explain this somewhat. If every other seemingly living being in the world were just robots, filled with no consciousness or sense of self, but only the outward-facing illusion of it, complex automatons that have no inner experience whatsoever, well, why would mistreating or killing them be evil? It would be no more evil than destroying a toaster oven. The only difference is this toaster oven is trying to convince you that it's sentient. But if you know it's not, then what's the issue? Of course, there's the problem. Do the Slaad know, or do they just believe? And what forms the basis of morality? The consequences of your actions, or what you believe are the consequences of your actions? If you kill someone because you thought they were essentially an empty robot, but they weren't, does that make it okay? I would say no. But does that make it better? I would say yes. I think it's more forgivable to kill someone out of confusion or insanity than out of sheer malice, like the demons do. Slaadi may exhibit an extreme callousness toward all other life, but it's rooted in insanity, in a fundamental misapprehension of reality, not in hatred. And some might be satisfied in saying that the Slaadi are chaotic neutral simply because they don't care about being good or evil, that they don't give it any thought. And if that's you and it works for your games, that's fine. But I don't really think it works in terms of actual morality, as I described in the beginning of this video. And I'm a person who would like my in-game philosophy to be compatible with actual philosophy. The Slaadi consistently cause way too much harm for it to make sense that they're neutral. They may not be motivated by evil, but they nonetheless participate in evil. And it's not like they're out here doing spontaneous acts of good to balance out all the killing and enslaving they do. And they are doing it on purpose. Each of the planes of existence exerts a unique effect on magic. In 5th edition, there are 8 schools of magic. In 2nd edition, there are 10, or 13 if you count each of the elements separately, at least according to the way Planescape lays it out. If you look at the Wizard section in the 2nd edition Player's Handbook, it says that there are 9 schools of magic. Anyway, in any given plane, each of these schools can be enhanced, diminished, nullified, altered, or unaffected. To cancel out these changes requires the use of a spell key, which are also unique to each plane. And typically, each school of magic requires a different spell key, but sometimes individual spells have their own spell keys. In some planes, spell keys are physical objects, like how in Mount Celestia they're all metal objects in a different shape depending on the school of magic, and a higher purity of metal the higher level of the spell. But in other planes, spell keys might be actions, or thoughts, or words. Spell keys are typically secret, or at least not readily available knowledge. But one thing I don't talk about much in these videos is that this stuff just applies to wizardly magic, not priestly magic. In 2nd edition, those are the 2 types of magic. Paladins, clerics, druids, and rangers use priest spells. Mages and illusionists use wizard spells. It's hard to apply rules across editions, but in 5th edition we could probably think of this as wizards, sorcerers, bards, and those rogue and fighter subclasses that get spellcasting. The spellcasters that fall in the category of priests get their magic directly from their god. So they use a different magic system and have other different magic use restrictions in the outer planes. Watch the section near the end of this video if you want a few more details on that. The fact that all these magical alterations even exist, and that wizardly magic and priestly magic have their own alterations, is probably rather unappealing to a lot of people. I can definitely see that. These kinds of rules can certainly get cumbersome, so I think it would make sense to scrap them altogether. But on the other hand, they do provide a unique feeling and challenge for each plane you travel to. So you do miss out on some of the plane's vibe if you don't use these rules for magic use, which is why I like to talk about them in these videos. Limbo's effect on wizardly magic is especially harsh, as spellcasting comes with a large dose of unpredictability, mostly whether the spell will even work. Whenever you cast a spell, you first have to make an intelligence check. If you fail, the spell itself fails, but is still spent. If that happens out in the soup of Limbo, a wild surge happens, which in 5th edition terms you can think of as a random effect being rolled from the Sorcerer Wild Magic Surge table. So basically, something random happens. If you're on a piece of stabilized terrain, a wild surge happens only if you roll a 20 on that intelligence check, but the spell fails, so natural 20s are actually bad in this case. But Limbo also has effects on the Alteration, Conjuration, Divination, Illusion, Wild Magic, and Elemental schools. For Alteration, the final product of your spell may be far from what you intended. For instance, you might try to polymorph a Slaad into a newt, but end up turning it into a green dragon. If you succeed on that intelligence check that makes the spell happen in the first place, you then roll percentile dice, adding the spell's level but subtracting your character level. The higher number the result, the more different the result is from what you intended, according to the DM's discretion. But for example, when casting Flesh to Stone, you might end up turning Flesh to Cactus. But the higher level you are and the lower level the spell you're casting is, the less likely you are to end up with some freakishly unexpected result. Because the outer and inner planes are so far apart from each other, elementals, which usually come from the inner planes, summoned in any of the outer planes are actually pseudo-elementals. And whenever you summon one of those in Limbo, it's exceptionally difficult to control and interprets commands as loosely as possible. Plus, their attention span is extremely short, so you can't give them long and detailed commands, like trying to account for all the loopholes they might find. Aside from that, the School of Conjuration is affected in a rather specific way in Limbo. For one thing, the gods of Limbo respond to the spell Wish very frivolously, and casting it here is rather dangerous. For another thing, the spell Find Familiar is enhanced here. In 5th edition, this spell just lets you choose an animal from a list to be your familiar, but in 2nd edition, you rolled on a table and got whatever you rolled, and you can only cast this spell once per year. But in Limbo, you get multiple rolls, and you also get access to weirder creatures, or special versions of the ones you normally have access to, like ones that are exceptionally large, tough, or intelligent. You can sense how far away they are, and you choose one to start traveling to, and as soon as you make that choice, you lose awareness of the others. So, due to the choice and the possibility of getting better than average or more interesting creatures, Limbo is a popular spot for mid to high level wizards seeking a new familiar. Since Limbo is already so elemental in nature, elemental spells, the ones that succeed anyway, are much more powerful here than normal. The spell's duration and area of effect are both doubled. If a spell normally doesn't have a duration, now it does. And if a spell normally just affects one target, now it has a radius. So if you cast a fireball, for instance, it will be twice as big and it will linger where it exploded for 1d6 rounds. Divination is really difficult in Limbo. In addition to the check for spell success, you also have to make a saving throw, and if you fail that, the spell's results are so chaotic that you gain essentially no information. Illusion, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite. It can work so well that an illusion you create actually becomes real, because the matter you're working with is so malleable. Provided the spell goes off in the first place, every time you cast an illusion, there's a 10% chance that it will be fully real and permanent. At least as permanent as anything can be in Limbo. All spellcasting in Limbo has a chance of causing a wild surge, but if you cast wild magic, there's an additional chance of a wild surge happening. And if you cast wild magic while out in the soup, a wild surge is guaranteed to happen whether you succeed on the spell or not. Because of the ever-present chance of spells failing and possibly causing wild surges, spell keys are quite popular in Limbo. There are two types of spell keys in this plane, those for change and those for balance. Change keys are best for the schools of alteration, enchantment, and illusion, where balance keys are best for abjuration, conjuration, and evocation. What the keys actually are subject to constant change. What works one time is unlikely to work the next time. So rather than learning them from someone, it's more a matter of insight at the time of casting. Luckily, though, chaos shaping allows you to turn the chaos matter of Limbo into the materials you need for the key. So, for example, a key of change might be something like a blown smoke ring, or a pinch of salt dissolving in water. The key is undergoing a process of change as the spell is being cast. A key of balance might be something like a spinning coin or a dagger balancing on a fingertip. And for higher level spells, an element of risk is helpful, like balancing something fragile or dangerous. I said this earlier, but the sourcebook says it as well, that these spell keys for Limbo can get rather involved, and they're not intended to bog down gameplay, but rather to convey the unusual nature of the plane. I just gave you a whole lot of information about Limbo. Some would say too much, with more to come. But how does one actually get there? Well, the outer planes in general are kind of hard to get to for primes, people who live in the prime material plane, which is where most D&D campaigns are likely to begin. There are magic items that can do it, and there are some high-level spells, and there are some special places here and there with conduits directly to another plane. But these are typically remote or dangerous places such as mountain peaks or volcanoes. So really, there are 4 types of primes who travel to the outer planes. High-level spellcasters, people who know high-level spellcasters, professional adventurers, and people who end up there accidentally. Of course, if you're a planer, it's much easier, though still not actually that easy. Not all outer planes are equally well connected, which means that some are easier to get to than others. Some, it's almost like they're trying to draw people in, and some, it's like they're trying to make it hard for people to get there. The Grey Waste and Bitopia are a good example of those things, respectively. Limbo is on the harder side of planes to get to, and that's because it has so few connections with the interplanar pathways. Each of the outer planes is of course connected via portals with the 2 planes on either side of it in the Great Wheel diagram, as well as the Outlands. But many outer planes are connected to each other through vast interdimensional networks, or interplanar pathways, those being the River Oceanus, the River Styx, the World Tree Yggdrasil, and Mount Olympus. The only one of these that reaches Limbo is Yggdrasil, and in just one small spot. There's also the Infinite Staircase, the 5th interplanar pathway, but that leads everywhere. But because Limbo is relatively disconnected, it just leaves the good old-fashioned methods of entry. Taking a portal from the neighboring planes of Isgard, Pandemonium, or the Outlands, or taking a portal from Sigil, which is called the City of Doors because it's so thoroughly riddled with portals. The best place to look for portals to Limbo in Sigil is in the Hive, the slum in the Hive Ward that serves as the Chaositech's unofficial headquarters. Though just remember that taking a portal or conduit to Limbo is extremely dangerous, possibly more dangerous than to any other plane, and that's because there's no telling what sort of environment you'll end up in. At least when you go to the elemental plane of fire, you know to expect a sea of flame. But entering Limbo might deposit you into lava, solid rock, a sub-0 degree sea, a maelstrom of chaos broth, anything. Most portals to Limbo have no fixed destination, and even if they did, it wouldn't really matter because everything in Limbo is always moving around and changing shape anyway. The only portals with a reliable destination are the ones found in the domains of stabilized terrain. But even those have a tendency to misfire, dumping travelers far out in Limbo's chaos. Perhaps most people who go to Limbo don't travel there while alive, but instead go there in death, getting this plane as their afterlife due to how they behaved in life. There are 2 ways that this happens, through worship or through alignment. The people of D&D are largely polytheistic, but even so, many people have a patron deity, one god that they worship above all others. If your patron deity is a god of Limbo, you'll become a petitioner of that god's realm when you die. But if you don't have one particular patron deity, then it depends on your alignment. If you were chaotic neutral in life, but skewed a bit toward goodness, you'd go to Isgard. If you instead skewed a bit toward evil, you'd go to Pandemonium. If you skewed more toward neutrality, you'd go to the Outlands. But if you were purely chaotic neutral, you'd go to Limbo. But perhaps the most surefire way to get to Limbo that doesn't require dying is by taking the portal in Limbo's gate town. The Outlands, the plane of true neutrality at the center of the Great Wheel, contains 16 gate towns, towns built around portals that lead to each of the outer planes. Each gate town is a small-scale reflection of the plane it leads to, but if they become too similar, then they'll cosmically realign, getting sucked up by that plane. So gate towns are usually either just different enough to avoid cosmic realignment, or so similar that it could realign at any moment, and then a new town will have to be built to replace it. The gate town that leads to Limbo is called Xaos, pronounced chaos. It's a town gone mad, in a constant state of flux, defying all order. In fact, it's impossible to map. The only thing you can count on in town is that you can't count on anything. And sometimes you can't even count on that. Getting to town can prove a challenge too, so perhaps it's not as reliable a method of getting to Limbo as I said. But there is a simple trick to it. You see, Xaos, pronounced Xaos, is surrounded by every kind of terrain and climate. Jumbles of rocks, swamps, pits, fields, whatever, all lit by rainbows of light. You have to head directly into whatever the most frightening and mind-warping area is, and suddenly, you'll be in town. The town of Xaos, pronounced Saxo, has no set population, and no set structures either. Sometimes the city holds 1,000 people, sometimes 40,000, sometimes 5. The town has no real landmarks to speak of, because even if I told you what they are, by the time you get there, they'll be gone, replaced by something different entirely. Everything in town is an important landmark, a unique creation delightful or bewildering or horrendous or arousing or what have you to behold, existing once and never again, leaving only unstable memories in the minds of those who were privileged to see it. Likewise, the town of Xaos, pronounced Assox, has no set rulership. It's ruled by no one and everyone. Anyone in town might suddenly find that their words hold a new sense of authority, becoming the supreme lawgiver of the town. Then, a minute and a half later, they're just a regular person again. Even if it lasts a bit longer, it often doesn't amount to much anyway, considering that the laws often change or evaporate before they're ever actually applied. The town is comprised mostly of humans, Barriar, Slaadi, and Githzerai. The citizens of Xaos, pronounced Oxa, aren't thrown off by the instability of their reality. In fact, Shravna Pakamorpundu, Krabitsnava Bagfleur Pondidu, Narzi Bonuto, and then we'll try sprinkling our adopted butter under the doorknobs. Everything in the city changes, and so do they. That's the way things should be, and they're used to it. You might get attacked by some warrior for no reason when you arrive, only to find that same person is now the waiter politely serving you a steaming cup of lint soup for evening breakfast. The locals like to watch visitors slowly go insane as they try to make sense of things here. While you're in Xaos, pronounced Soaks, you've got to have a firm grasp on your own identity, at least if you want to keep it. Otherwise, it will change, along with everything else in town. The townsfolk may be chaotic and ever-changing, but they do have goals. They just pursue their goals in a rather peculiar, roundabout way. For example, a Slaad intent on killing you might send flowers first. A Chaositect builds an army by randomly painting buildings. If you want to find an elusive target, maybe build a bathtub first. In this town, these things just work. For as chaotic as the town of Xaos, pronounced Bob, is, it's no surprise that it's teetering on the edge of cosmic realignment, perilously and joyously close to slipping into limbo. Some say the town jumps back and forth between Limbo and the Outlands, and things are so chaotic that nobody can tell the difference. But some say the Slaadi have an interest in keeping the town in the Outlands, and they're trying to literally, physically keep it in place. And they're not the only group that's trying to establish some semblance of order in town. There's a group of Modrons, recent arrivals in town, who have been trying to build something that'll last, but each of their constructs changes as soon as they're built. Even the Modrons themselves are changing, losing confidence in their identities and warping into new shapes. But that's all 2nd edition. 5th edition Xaos, pronounced Corntoss, is a little different, though it is similar in many ways. It's still surrounded by extreme and varied terrain, the buildings still shift and change, the townsfolk can't agree on how to pronounce the town's name, and the town's leader still changes at random, which is made visible by a crystal crown that appears over the current ruler's head. And the laws that they create are still temporarily and mostly feudal, as criminals rarely serve their full sentences. But in 5th edition, there is a bit more stability here. While the structures do dissolve and reform into other things at random, and the cobblestone streets ripple in waves that upend and rearrange themselves without warning, there are actually a few landmarks in town, as there are a few stable anchors that resist the town's volatility, serving as foundations for regions that don't change. Most of these places are owned by the Githzerai, and in fact, in 5th edition, Githzerai are the primary citizens. The Githzerai Embassy is one such landmark. It's an island of order amidst a sea of chaos, an adamantine citadel floating above town, held up in the air by collective thought and meditation. It does change shape from time to time, but this is an intentional decision by Almera, the Githzerai sage who oversees the embassy's operations. While it does act as a legitimate embassy, It's also a front for the Xaos Ku, a group who defy all Githzerai and Githyanki society by fervently pursuing the goal of Gith reunification. They are considered radicals and outlaws by both groups, thus the secrecy. So both Githzerai and Githyanki live in harmony inside the embassy, having children together who they simply call Gith. Word has started to spread that there's a Xaos Ku enclave somewhere in the Outlands, so occasionally Githyanki can be found around town, looking for evidence, as their Lich Queen Vlaakith pays well for the heads of these traitors. Another landmark is the Slaadi Nest. There is a mysterious geometric pillar at the edge of town riddled with holes that the Slaadi cocoon their tadpole-infested victims inside. And then there's the Cube, an undulating, four-dimensional mass of repeating fractals floating above town. You see, just like in 2nd edition, Modrons from the far end of the Outlands came to Xaos, pronounced Flernpops, to establish order. They built a lawful outpost of polished brass that they called the Cube, but the chaotic influence of the town corrupted it, causing it to collapse in on itself, with a bunch of Modrons inside. Now the Cube is in a constant state of flux, and some say that the Cube is alive, a sapient construct that feeds on the town's disorderly residents. But in truth, it doesn't just feed on the disorderly, as most who enter the Cube are never seen again, even the groups of Modrons that are periodically sent to re-establish control over the Cube. Those who've seen the inside and returned claim that it's a hostile realm of mathematical impossibilities, a clockwork house of horrors. The final landmark in town is the most important, though unlike these others, it's always shifting, and that's the Gate to Limbo. It's pretty much the same in both 2nd and 5th edition. It changes along with the city. One minute it might be a small blue pyramid in the palm of a statue. The next, a pit lined with spikes, a glowing door standing alone in a river of lava, or a liquid in a chalice that must be sipped to transport you to Limbo. Whatever shape it takes, it's always easy to identify it as the gate, as chaos swells around it, like the eye of a maelstrom of change. Since all of the layers of Limbo are pretty much interchangeable with one another, if they even exist at all, it wouldn't really make sense to go through the locations layer by layer. I wouldn't even know which locations to put in each layer, and that's precisely it. There is no stable relationship between location and layer, because the locations move, and so do the layers. So I'll cover the sites and towns in this section, and the gods and their realms in the next. But one place that remains surprisingly constant within Limbo's ever-changing soup is Pinwheel. It was given that name because it's a floating island that's constantly spinning, with streamers of half-formed matter whirling from the edges. It's a vast disk of mostly forest about 150 miles in radius. It has its own gravity and air. While the island looks circular at first, there's a large indent in the coastline filled with an eddy of chaos matter called the Swamp. A branch of Yggdrasil reaches into Limbo, taking root in the center of Pinwheel where a small mountain rises to meet it. The forest is pretty diverse, with pines and firs in the mountainous center, maples and oaks in the middle band, and a humid jungle at its edges. There's a high population of animal life here, and it's also extremely varied. Some of the animals are quite large and vicious, so Pinwheel doesn't have any permanent residents aside from these animals. It's unusual that there even is animal life here, as the chaos matter of Limbo can spontaneously form into all sorts of things, but not animals. It takes genius-level chaos shapers or anarchs to form the soup into animals. And the peculiar thing about Pinwheel is that it retains its form without the maintenance of some intelligence. So how does Pinwheel remain stable? Well, many people believe that the branch of Yggdrasil imposes stability on it. But others aren't convinced by that, as it takes thoughts to shape the chaos of Limbo, and Yggdrasil isn't a thinking being. Could it not be possible for a branch of Yggdrasil to reach into Limbo without having any effect on the broth? So some believe that it goes the other way around. Maybe Pinwheel isn't stable because Yggdrasil touches it, but Yggdrasil touches it because it's stable. But then that still leaves the question, how is it stable? Some people believe that Pinwheel is the realm of some unknown god, because after all, the gods of Limbo don't have to be in their realms for them to remain intact. Some believe that that god will someday return to reclaim the land. Others believe that the land itself is a sleeping god, and so they come here every so often to worship. Some sages hypothesize that Pinwheel is actually the center of Limbo, a sort of focal point within all the chaos, the eye of the storm, and so remains stable for that reason. In truth, No one knows why Pinwheel is this way. It just is, and it's a rather important site. The presence of the vicious and extremely numerous animals keep people from setting up permanent habitation, but it doesn't stop them from visiting. It serves as an excellent neutral meeting ground for councils, deals, negotiations, and whatnot. There's a collection of enormous holes on one side of the island, called lakes because the holes are filled with chaos matter. When anarchs visit, they pull the chaos matter up from the pools to create giant walls to encircle the lakes, making a protected area about 50 miles across. Because of its popularity as a meeting point, a huge Gaidon has been constructed here, a great three-sided pyramid of granite and marble that can withstand the attention of even Pinwheel's biggest animals when no one is here. Barnstable is another site in Limbo. It's a quaint halfling village that might look rather out of place in Limbo. That is, if Limbo had a consistent enough identity for anything to look out of place in. But it actually is out of place. Barnstable was originally a sleepy halfling town in some prime material world, but an unexpected surge of wild magic transported the whole place to Limbo. The halflings got the hang of chaos shaping before the broth killed them all, and without any way to get back home, they decided to just stay here. Though there are no natural anarchs among the halflings, so the townsfolk have to take turns concentrating to maintain the surrounding terrain. The youth of Barnstable like to play pranks on the town by rearranging the locations of people's homes at night when it's their turn to shape the chaos. The older townsfolk just put up with it because they don't want to have to take the night shifts. The mayor of Barnstable is an old halfling by the name of Tudbury Tuffle, and he's the ruler of town simply because he's the oldest, at the ripe age of 190, which is about 40 years past a halfling's life expectancy, and that shows in Tudbury. He's grown quite senile and isn't really fit to rule anything, but he's also hard of hearing and has a very faint voice, so his nephew acts as his interpreter, and old Tudbury hardly ever notices when the townsfolk don't do what he wanted. Barnstable looks like a floating island, mostly taken up by a huge oak tree with subterranean halfling homes nestled among its roots. The only above-ground building is a large central barn where communal property is stored, like ponies, goats, and food. And I think this drawing, while cool, isn't actually reflective of what the town looks like, as there's supposed to be a wood surrounding the town. Barnstable doesn't have a militia to speak of, so their method of protecting themselves is to shape the woods, making them impenetrably thick and making all paths lead back out. But if you aren't perceived as a threat and they let you in, the townsfolk are quite friendly. They don't really have much of use to trade, they have no use for money, and the only news that reaches town is the news you bring with, but you can at least get a quiet place to rest, good food, and cheery company. Since the Githzerai are one of the two primary races of Limbo, they control a lot of territory. Their largest city is called Shraktlor, and it's probably not just the largest Githzerai city, but the largest city in the whole plane. It has 2 million inhabitants, which is a very high number as far as D&D city populations go. To put that in perspective for you, Sigil, basically the central hub city of the entire multiverse, supposedly has only about 1 million inhabitants, but only 1/3 of that million are permanent residents. But anyway, Githzerai society is divided into two main sectors, military and religion, and Shraktlor is their military capital. It's designed to be the final defensive point for Githzerai society should all of their other strongholds fall, which should tell you something about the mindset of the Githzerai. Zareth Menyar Ag Gith, the Great Githzerai, or God King, is their ultimate ruler, and this is his military seat of power, though he's typically not found here, and instead the city is ruled by a council of Githzerai generals. They struggle among themselves for rulership, and the Great Githzerai encourages these struggles, believing that it brings out the best in them, and it prevents them from ever challenging his authority as supreme ruler. Shraktlor is a rather austere place, as you would expect from the Githzerai. The city has 7 rings of thick granite walls with massive iron gatehouses. Living quarters in the city are rather small and cramped, though this suits the Githzerai just fine. It's quite the grim place, and entertainment is nowhere to be found, though it is a good place to buy weapons, so long as you're not buying in bulk, as that would draw the suspicions of the city's army. As is typical of Githzerai cities, foreigners aren't allowed in, unless with an escort, and any who wish to stay must live in tents outside the gates. While the armies of the God King patrol inside the city, they don't wish to waste their manpower on foreigners, so the foreign quarter is kept orderly by a band of mercenaries on the Great Githzerai's payroll known as the Foreign Brigade. The city of Shraktalor proper is rather quiet, a poor place to seek out rumors, but the tent city outside is always abuzz with tales and gossip. The Githzerai's religious seat of power is known as the Floating City, or the Citadel of Gith, though the Githzerai have a somewhat unique way of expressing that religiosity. Instead of priests, they have mages, and they also have a lot of thieves, as the God King has integrated a respect for thievery into his worship because of its usefulness in their never-ending war against the Githyanki for infiltration and gathering intel. The Floating City is where the God King Xaereth normally resides, but he keeps a cadre of mages on hand who rule the city under him. To keep them from becoming powerful enough to challenge him, he prevents them from progressing beyond 9th level. If he ever needs a more powerful servant, he'll handpick and personally train someone, only to kill them when their task is done. This has led to something of a political game of pretend ineptitude. For example, Xaereth's current most trusted advisor is a female named Morgan Deverax, who has earned his trust without being viewed as a threat to his power because she pretends to have no talent for spellcasting. Like Shraktalor, the Floating City is silent and austere, but it's different in a few ways as well. It's a place of tall spires connected by bare stone walkways, and there's a sorcerous glow about the entire city. The streets are narrow and winding. Foreigners are allowed access to the whole city, except for the central tower of luminescence, where the God King and his council of mages live. Though since thievery is held in such high regard here, it might not be recommendable to come here, as you'll become a target of every thief in the city. In fact, the city guard, known as the Thieves' Justice, doubles as a thief training school. In a normal city, if you get pickpocketed, you could try turning to the City Watch for aid. But here, the City Watch are likely to be the people robbing you. And this is actually how the Thieves' Justice punishes troublemakers, by fining them through pickpocketing. But despite this, there are still good reasons to visit the Floating City. It's an excellent source of magical goods and thieves training, though the Githzerai are a bit cautious of providing too much to outsiders, in case the goods and services they provide get turned back on them. And the Floating City is also the seat of the Anarchs Guild. Of course, other branches, both official and unofficial, can be found throughout Limbo, but this is the main one. In addition to their cities, there are also numerous Githzerai monasteries scattered throughout Limbo. The monastery of Zerthadlun is one of them. Many Githzerai monasteries teach their own specialized martial art, and this one is no different. The monks of Zerthadlun follow the teachings of Sensei Balthameus, and the martial art they practice, Zerthi, allows them to peer a moment into the future to help them fight. The monastery of Zerthadlun looks like a glade of stone spires and towers layered onto a sphere about a quarter-mile in diameter, pretty much like a planet from Mario Galaxy. And the monastery interior looks like an M.C. Escher drawing, with winding stairs that connect to floors, walls, and ceilings. This location is from 3rd edition, which uses subjective gravity for Limbo, where you can freely choose which surface you're pulled to. So really, every surface is a possible floor, and the monastery is built with that concept in mind. The life of a Githzerai monk is strict and harsh, but apparently worth it. They even teach non-Githzerai here, but you've got to prove yourself for a few months, learning the basics and following the uncompromising schedule and lifestyle of the monastery. In 4th edition, Zerthadlun is not a monastery, but rather this is the Githzerai's greatest city, with a population of 20,000. If you try to make sense of the editions of D&D as a continuous timeline, which I don't think makes sense in most cases, things look rather bleak for the Githzerai. One of their monasteries turned into their greatest city, which has a population 1% as big as that of their old greatest city. Another Githzerai location from 4th edition is Arseneth, a small monastery deep within the elemental chaos, where only those who have touched enlightenment dwell. The inhabitants of Arseneth are said to have such control over the surrounding chaos that they alter it purely by instinct, so they're anarchs. What's unusual about this Githzerai settlement is that they welcome all who have glimpsed enlightenment, even Githyanki. Another 4th edition Githzerai monastery is Sanzarathad, though this one is not so successful. The founders of this monastery evidently chose a horrible spot, as it sits right at the confluence of multiple chaos currents. So not even the most skilled anarch can hold off the forces of chaos that constantly assault it. It's essentially a battle being lost in slow motion. Every day, the Githzerai lose more ground to the chaos, but they don't give up the fight because there's something in the center of the monastery that they must protect at all costs. If you gain the trust of the Githzerai who live here, they might speak of a room with no doors, but they never divulge what's inside. But some have their suspicions. You see, to the Githzerai, thought is as real an element as fire or water, and this idea is central to the practices of the monks of Sanzarathad. By using the power of thought to shape the world around them, they aren't just guarding against chaos, but madness as well. So perhaps what lies in the room with no doors is a thought so terrible that its release would eventually corrupt all existence. Sanzarathad is protected by large stone walls and sits on a landmass a few dozen miles across. Most of the residents fall into one of two groups. The Blades of Discipline are the masters of magic and martial arts, fending off the creatures that the elemental chaos throws at them. The Hands of Order are the Anarchs and Thinkers, those of strong will who spend hours in concentration, working in shifts to hold the monastery together. The other dominant race in Limbo, the Slaadi, have a few prominent locations as well. While there are nearly as many named Slaad locations as Githzerai ones, keep in mind that the Slaadi prefer to live in the Chaos Soup, so the Githzerai definitely have far more settlements and strongholds, even if D&D doesn't tell you what they're called. By far the most important Slaad site is the Spawning Stone, though the Isgardians call it Slaadheim, and the Githzerai call it Urkrakal. It's their primordial home, and where all Slaadi regularly return to for their mating season. The nature of these mating seasons at the stone are described a bit contradictorily, though, as the power of the spawning stone is needed to fertilize their eggs, but it's also where their eggs are hatched, even though they already set up incubation camps near the battlefields where they steal bodies from to serve as vessels for new Slaadi. I suppose all of these things could be true. Slaadi might set up these camps all around for hatching their babies, but they also hatch them at the spawning stone on a seasonal basis, and they also visit the spawning stone to fertilize their eggs that will be implanted into people later. And while the Slaadi are fertilizing each other's egg sacs at the stone, sometimes they produce new Slaadi by implanting their eggs into each other in their mating frenzy. So there's always at least a few dead Slaadi floating about the stone. Each type of Slaad goes to the spawning stone in a sequence during their respective mating seasons. First the red, then the blue, then green, then gray, and then death Slaadi, who give way to the red again. Though another contradiction here, or at least confusion, is why do the green, gray, and death Slaadi even have a mating season? They don't breed. The lesser Slaadi breed and then evolve into the greater Slaadi. So what do the death Slaadi need to go to the spawning stone for? It could just be that they like to do so, or feel compelled to do so, but doing it for breeding purposes is just inconsistent. However, there is always one death Slaad here, known as the Guardian of the Stone, who has the powers of an Anarch, and it's said that anyone who can take control of the stone from the Guardian gains those same powers. The spawning stone is a colossal blue-gray boulder shaped like an enormous horseshoe. The interior is honeycombed with the circular rooms that the Slaadi like. The various types of Slaadi each have their own preferences of things like temperature and aesthetics, so there are 5 different flavors of chaos in the spawning grounds surrounding the stone. For instance, the Death Slaadi enjoy acid fogs and poisoned gas clouds, which make the area uninhabitable for the first Red Slaadi to arrive when they come to push the Death Slaadi out. But while I'm thinking of contradictions and inconsistencies, here's 2 more. This book says that there are a half dozen known Death Slaadi, and that doesn't seem to jive with the description this book gives of the spawning stone. There's always one Death Slaadi here, so you're telling me that the swarm of Death Slaadi is literally just 5 guys? And the other one is that if there's one spawning ground around the stone for each type of Slaad, why do they need to push each other out in cycles? If the Red Slaadi like their Red Slaadi space, it's not like they'd be using the Green Slaadi space or the Death Slaadi space. And they must not push each other out all the time, because the Slaadi also use the spawning stone as a sort of town, meeting place, and storage site for the entire race. So it must be that most of the time it's just one type of Slaad here at any given time. But every once in a while, multiple types meet up, or groups consisting of multiple types come here together. Currents of chaos matter flow toward the stone, or away from it in 3rd edition. When the stone changes hands, or when eggs hatch, massive tidal waves of chaos roll out from the stone for hundreds of miles. No non-Slaadi are allowed within a few miles of the stone, and Anarchs report having difficulty in chaos shaping within 100 miles of it. In 4th edition, the spawning stone is a sphere with burning white runes on its surface, and rather than a constant cycle of Slaadi mating, a portion of the Slaad population feels an undeniable urge to travel to the stone once every few years, with no predictable pattern. According to 4th edition lore, where the Slaadi might originate from an infinite number of different realities, the few Slaadi that study the runes on the spawning stone believe that they not only keep them in their frog-like forms, but also confine them to a single reality. Similar runes sometimes appear on the Pandemonium stone from 4th edition, which might also play a role in imprisoning the Slaadi to one reality. The Pandemonium stone is a spire more than 100 feet in diameter and more than 500 feet tall, variously made of bone, flesh, ice, minerals, wind, wood, and other things, always in flux. It manifests randomly, bursting into existence like a volcanic eruption, sending ripples of chaos in all directions. Some creatures have chosen to take up residence here. There's an extraplanar sanctuary at the base of the stone known as the Trackless House that serves as an inn and safe house for travelers. Then, near the apex of the stone, there's the abode of the Watchers of Tomorrow. They're mostly comprised of Maruts, but there are also some renegade angels and a devil in the group as well. The Watchers of Tomorrow believe that the Pandemonium Stone is the cocoon of an entity of enormous power, perhaps a god of gods. The Watchers plan on waiting until it hatches to either swear their allegiance to it or destroy it, depending on what it turns out to be. After the Pandemonium Stone appears, it eventually starts to call out, summoning all sorts of creatures from across the elemental chaos, most prominently Slaadi. After a few days of war between the various groups, a Slaad lord always arrives and forces out all other groups, as no creature powerful enough to best a Slaad lord has ever joined the fight. Then the Slaadi start to croak out a horrendously disharmonic song. The Watchers of Tomorrow believe that this song helps the development of the god growing inside the spire. But others believe that the Pandemonium Stone is itself a giant Slaad kept asleep by the song. But not long after the Slaad song, the spire shifts out of existence once more, dragging nearby objects and creatures with it. Anyone who remains nearby will reappear along with the stone, wherever and whenever that happens. The final Slaadi site in Limbo is the Great Red Tempest. It's a chaos storm in the elemental chaos so large and so long-lasting that it's been given a name. It extends for miles in all directions. The Slaadi like to ride behind the Great Red Tempest on stones the size of mountains, or swim in the miniature seas that spin in its wake, ready to jump off when the storm travels through inhabited regions to attack and inject their eggs into the survivors. Slaadi come and go from the Great Red Tempest, but there's always a Void Slaad at the storm's heart, meditating on a way to use the power of the storm to bring down the walls of creation. There are 18 gods of Limbo, at least one's listed in the D&D books, and depending on how you count, there may be less, as we'll see. But there's also the Slaad Lords, if you consider them to be gods, and many people do, especially people who live in Limbo. But since I already discussed them, I won't talk about them again here. The gods of Limbo include Fenmarel Messerine, Agni, Indra, Vayu, Shinasuhiko, Susano, Sirion, Procon, Ralishaz, Tempest, Lara, Targus, Mistral, Tepan, Huanti, Estilibor, and Koreska. Fenmarel Messerine is one of the gods of the Seldarine, the Elven pantheon. Most of that pantheon resides in Arborea, and according to the World Tree cosmology, which is primarily used in the Forgotten Realms campaign setting in 3rd edition, so does Fenmarel. But in the Great Wheel cosmology of Planescape, he's here in Limbo. That's because he's something of an outcast and loner god, and because he's chaotic neutral rather than chaotic good, though a mismatch of alignment doesn't stop plenty of other gods from keeping their realms where they do. Fenmarel is the god of feral elves and scapegoats. Unlike most of the elven gods, he's rather sullen and serious. He used to be Lolth's lover, but he didn't want to embrace evil like she did, so he left her. His realm is known as Fenimar. It's a wide stretch of lonely forest connected with quiet glades, hidden valleys, and clear streams tucked into a savage mountain range that keeps away unwelcome visitors. There are a few passes through the mountains, but it takes a special kind of determination to follow them. The realm is pleasant, though a bit bleak, and it's mostly stable. However, the weather in Fenimar is extremely chaotic, with the temperature and precipitation fluctuating by the hour. One moment the sun is scorching, and then suddenly winds rise to bring a bone-chilling rain. The realm serves many purposes. It's home to hermits, rangers, and a great many wild creatures. It's a haven for those who've been wrongly accused of crimes against their people. It's a place for elves to come grieve on the rare occasions when they lose their characteristic equanimity. It's a training ground for elven rangers. It's a retreat for those who have gotten sick of the hubbub of civilization. And it's a great place to come for those who want to be alone, away from prying eyes. There are no towns or villages anywhere in the realm, as that would defeat the purpose of what Fenimar is all about. The most you'll find are way stations scattered all around. They're typically devoid of people, but kept well provisioned for travelers by Fenimar's unseen rangers. These rangers have the ability to become completely undetectable as long as they remain still within the underbrush, like the Night Elf Shadowmeld ability in World of Warcraft, except better. Shevarash, elven god of vengeance, crusades, and loss, can sometimes be found in Fenimar as well. Indra, Agni, and Vayu are gods of the Vedic pantheon, and they're known as the three gods of chaos. They're gods of elemental strength and unpredictable temperament. And fitting the rule of threes, one is good, one is neutral, and one is evil. They share a loose, patternless realm called Swarga, or Svarga. Gods often reside in planes that don't match their alignment. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. Perhaps Agni's good balances out Indra's evil, allowing the realm to remain secure in limbo. Swarga is little more than random storms, raging flames, and howling winds. Most things that look permanent here have only been built just to be destroyed. Anarchs and other chaos shapers have learned to stay away from this realm, as trying to impose your will over the chaos matter here invites the wrath of the gods themselves. Indra is the chaotic evil god of weather and battle. Agni is the chaotic good god of fire and messages, and Vayu is the chaotic neutral god of wind, life, and destruction. The only truly permanent structures in the realm are their three palaces, though they don't retain a permanent shape or location within the realm. Indra's palace is a huge marble blob covered in gold carvings, and the surrounding land is constantly blanketed in rain. Agni's palace is an ever-burning castle of flame, and only those specifically blessed by Agni can enter unharmed. Vayu has a cloud palace of unpredictable winds. But that's according to this book. This book, from 1st edition, puts Indra and Agni in separate realms. Swarga is Indra's realm. It's a great spherical vault halfway filled with a sea of enchanted milk. And Indra's palace is in the center, floating either on an island-sized tortoise or a tortoise-shaped island. Agni's realm is also a sphere, but it's filled with the purest of flames. Agni makes sure it doesn't accidentally destroy any other domains or creatures as it moves throughout the plane. And Vayu isn't mentioned. Indra, Agni, and Vayu are of course gods from real-world mythology, where things are a bit different. In real-world mythology, Indra is basically the Hindu version of Zeus, god of weather, lightning, thunder, storms, and rain, and is king of the gods. He's also a god of order. I'm not sure why D&D made him chaotic evil. Agni is a triple-aspected god, represented on Earth as fire, in the atmosphere as lightning, and in the sky as the sun, and acts as a messenger between gods and humans. Vayu is also a messenger god, but as far as I can tell, more of a messenger between the gods themselves. Shinasuhiko is the Japanese god of the wind, and his realm is called Wind's Home. That's really all there is to say about it. Even in real-world mythology, there's never very much available information on the internet about the lesser Shinto gods, or kami, though Susanoo, or Sozanowo, is one of those more important Japanese gods where there is a bit more information. In D&D, he's the Japanese god of storms. He's unpredictable and perplexing. Even the other Japanese gods don't understand him, and in fact are rather consternated by his exploits, and so have banished him from their presence, so he keeps a realm in the formless soup of limbo called the Globe of Raging Chaos. It's a 1,000-mile-wide spherical vault, half filled with salt water that churns with storms and sweeps through the plane, wrecking any attempt to establish order that it can. In real-world mythology, he's the god of the sea, storms, and fields, with many contradictory characteristics and stories. Sirion is the god of flame and change from Kryn Space, which is the crystal sphere of the Dragonlance campaign setting. He's a god of creativity, passion, and alchemy. He controls every physical flame, and those that rage out of control are the domain of a different deity, Sarganas. Sirion doesn't care much about gaining worshippers, but he accepts those who are drawn to him through their love of the beauty of fire and the change it can enable. He rejects those who seek to use fire for only its power. In the cosmology that Dragonlance itself uses, Sirion, along with his wife Shannara and the other gods of neutrality, reside in the outer plane known as the Hidden Veil. In Planescape, though, Sirion's realm is in Limbo, and it's known as the Flame Void. I think it's an open question how these two pieces of information interact. You could have it that the cosmology of Dragonlance is just superseded by Planescape, only to be used if you're specifically playing a Dragonlance game, or it could be that both things are true at once, somehow. Perhaps the Hidden Veil is an outer plane from the perspective of the people of Krynn, but really it's just a conglomeration of locales from various outer planes, and the Flame Void is one of them. Perhaps all the realms that make up the Hidden Veil are connected, maybe through portals, or maybe a person who sees things the Krynnish way would indeed experience all of the realms that make up the Hidden Veil as one plane, even if it isn't truly that way from the perspective of others. Planescape is meant to be a weird and nonsensical setting, after all. Procan is the god of the seas, oceans, and weather of the Greyhawk campaign setting, known as Greyspace. He's as mercurial as the wind, vacillating between high spirits, humor, and passion for life, and dark brooding, pessimism, and violence. Whatever kind of mood he's in, it doesn't last long. What is consistent about him is his greed for treasure, hoarding whatever falls to the bottom of the seafloor. His realm is known as Sea's Edge. Ralashaz is another god of Greyspace, the god of chance and ill luck, as well as madness. Despite the fact that he's associated with bad luck more than good luck, he's often the patron deity of gamblers and those who take unusual risks. And despite the fact that I said he, Ralashaz doesn't really have a gender. He takes on whatever form he wants to, and often his form morphs repeatedly before your eyes in a manner that's rather awful and disturbing to behold. One moment taking the form of a beautiful maid, then shifting to an old and scabby beggar. His realm is called the Kiss of Luck. Tempest is the god of war and warriors of the Forgotten Realms campaign setting, known as Realm Space. Tempest favors all sides in war equally, and it's said that he lives for excess, whether in battle, food, or drink. His realm is known as Night's Rest. It's like Asgard on crack. Battles rage here endlessly, and getting killed is just a minor inconvenience. You lie on the ground dead for a short time while your body heals. Then you rise again to fight on the side of the guy who killed you. Death is only permanent for cowards. Lara is the goddess of deception and illusions of Realm Space. Or perhaps I should say was, because she got killed shortly after the Time of Troubles by Cyric, the god of murder, strife, and lies, and Mask, the god of thieves, thievery, and shadows. But then it turned out that she wasn't actually killed. This is somewhat of a retcon, but also rather fitting for the goddess of deception and illusions to fake her own death. Her realm is known as the Courts of Illusions. Targus was the god of war in the ancient Netherese Empire in Realm Space. He was associated more with the destruction and plundering side of war than the tactics and strategies side. But that destruction was mindless, not with evil intent. But it seems that Targus was renamed to Garagos in this book. Garagos used to be the primary god of war in ancient Faerun, but was beaten by Tempest, who took that position from him. And since then, Garagos became a bit evil, so his realm of Battle Guard that used to be in Limbo is now in Pandemonium. Mistral was the Netherese goddess of magic, invention, and knowledge. She was the first incarnation of the goddess of magic in Realm Space. She was robbed of her powers by the archwizard Karsus, using an artifact known as the Crown of Karsus, that you may be familiar with if you played Baldur's Gate 3, because the main story revolves around it. The power of Mistral proved too much for Karsus to bear, and to prevent the destruction of the Weave, which is the source of all magic, at least in Realm Space, Mistral sacrificed herself to break Karsus's connection to it. This caused magic to stop working for a short period of time, and so the Netherese Empire, being heavily dependent on magic with its giant floating cities and all that, came to a rather sudden end. The magic that made the Crown of Karsus and the floating cities of Netheril possible were 10th level spells, and so when the new goddess of magic, Mystra, was born, she took a much more controlling and lawful stance on magic, disallowing 10th level spells from being used at all. Mistral's realm, when it existed, was in Limbo, and was called Dwemertor. Tapan is the god of the Chorids, which are a kind of fey creature like dwarven satyrs. though in my Guide to Arborea video, I said that Dav is the patron deity of the Chorids. These two pieces of information are from different sources, and neither one mentions the other god, so I'm not quite sure what to make of it. But Tapan is mentioned in both older and newer books than Dav is, so if we've got to go with one, I guess it would be Tapan. Though I suppose the Chorids could have two gods, plenty of other races do, just usually not minor ones like Chorids. Tapan is a god of laughter and dance, and his realm is a hill studded with standing stones, but he spends most of the time in the prime material plane, helping the Chorids. According to this book, there's a demigod named Huan Ti who has a realm here. Huan Ti is a war god, and I would guess that he's a member of the celestial bureaucracy, the Chinese pantheon. Specifically, I would imagine that this is referring to Huang Di, the Yellow Emperor, a mythical hero figure in Chinese folklore. But I can't find other mentions of him in D&D texts. They probably exist in some book, I just didn't find it. Anyway, his realm is a mass of smoke, with a great palace of flaming bamboo in the center. The flames don't actually consume anything though, and are ever burning. Astilabor is the dragon god of the acquisition of wealth. Typically, dragons in D&D are split between the good metallic dragons and the evil chromatic dragons, but Astilabor is revered by all dragons, and thus appears both chromatic and metallic. To the evil ones, she represents greed, and to the good or neutral ones, she represents not so much greed, but the acquisition of status through wealth. Her realm, which is hidden somewhere in Limbo, is said to hold a hoard with more wealth than can be found in the entirety of the prime material plane. But this book makes Astilabor true neutral rather than chaotic neutral, and so places her realm in the Outlands. Koreska is the dragon god of magic. Like Astilabor, she is revered by all dragons, because magic is used by both good and evil. She always looks like a dragon, but the exact form and color she takes changes often, and there isn't really any information about her realm. And that concludes the Guide to Limbo. I hope you enjoyed it. It was honestly a bit longer than I thought it would be. Yeah, that's partially because I had a lot to say about the morality of chaotic neutrality, but also there was just more information about Limbo itself than I had originally thought. And despite the length, there's still probably some stuff that I missed. Unintentionally missed, as there is always plenty of small details that I deliberately don't include. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel. If you've enjoyed a few of my videos, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. My supporters get access to update posts, ad-free videos, audio-only videos weeks before the full video, and they get their names at the end of my videos and the ability to vote on future videos. And if you want to show your support for what I do but get something tangible out of it as well, then consider using code WadeAllen at dicenest.com for 15% off your order. But whatever you do, thank you for watching.